I tore my hands to shreds, dragging my wife away from the edge of a sheer drop. My reward was watching her stand up, dust off her knees, and pull a serrated hunting knife from her belt. She severed my safety line and watched me plummet 80 feet into the Columbia River Gorge. When I finally woke up in the hospital, a police officer leaned close to my shattered body. "She booked your funeral yesterday," he said, pulling an evidence bag from his jacket. Then he showed me the receipt. The wind howling through the Columbia River Gorge was deafening. My heavy hiking boots scrambled against the loose shale, sending cascades of gray rock tumbling into the abyss below. Every muscle in my 54-year-old back screamed in pure agony. The thick nylon climbing rope burned right through my heavy leather gloves, biting deep into the flesh of my palms, but I absolutely refused to let go. Below me, dangling over a drop that meant certain death, was Caroline. We had been married for 24 years. I built a mid-sized logistics brokerage from a single desk in our guest room into a company that moved freight across the entire Midwest. I spent my life calculating risks. I routed 18-wheelers through blizzards in the Dakotas' managed supply chain bottlenecks and ensured millions of dollars in commercial cargo reached its destination safely. I was a man who built his life on predictability, on safety nets, on rock-solid contracts. I provided everything for my family. The sprawling 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, the private Christian school tuition for our kids who were now grown and out of the house, the generous Sunday morning tithes at our church. I thought my marriage was the most secure contract of all. I thought I knew the woman I was trying to save. But the last 12 months had been a living nightmare. Her younger brother Bradley was a flashy commercial real estate developer who played fast and loose with other people's money. He was the golden boy of her family, the one who drove the leased Porsche and talked about paradigm shifts at Thanksgiving dinners. When his latest vanity project, a massive luxury condo development, hit a fatal cash flow crisis, Caroline begged me to bail him out. I gave him a massive bridge loan. Then I gave him another. When I finally cut him off to save our own retirement accounts, Caroline accused me of abandoning her family. She told our friends I was being financially controlling. Our house became a toxic war zone of silent dinners and slammed doors. She always looked at Bradley like he was the brilliant visionary while I was just the blue-collar guy who got lucky moving freight. That was why we were on this treacherous cliff in the first place. Caroline had come to my home office a week ago with tears welling in her eyes. She said she was so sorry for the fighting. She said she wanted to fix us to reconnect away from the city, away from the financial stress, and away from her brother. She suggested this advanced guided hiking trail in the Pacific Northwest. I was so desperate to save my marriage that I agreed without a second thought. I bought all the top-tier climbing gear. I double-checked every carabiner and anchor point. Now she was slipping off the side of a crumbling limestone ledge. "Hold on!" I roared over the screaming wind. The logistics of the pulley system we had set up were failing under the awkward angle. The heavy steel anchor carabiner groaned against the rock face. Caroline was sobbing her hands, slipping frantically from the wet, mossy stone. I braced my boots against a jagged tree root protruding from the dirt, wrapping the slack of the rope around my forearm. The pain was blinding. I felt a muscle tear violently in my right shoulder, but the massive surge of adrenaline masked the worst of the trauma. "I am not letting my wife die," I told myself. I heaved backward with everything I had. Inch by agonizing inch, the heavy climbing rope pulled her upward. Her bruised fingers finally crested the ledge. I grabbed the collar of her heavy canvas jacket, hauling her dead weight over the lip of the cliff. She collapsed onto the flat, solid earth, gasping for air, and rolling onto her back. I dropped to my knees beside her, my chest heaving like a bellows. We were safe. I reached out to touch her shoulder to tell her it was over, to tell her I had her. But as I shifted my weight forward, the ground beneath my right boot simply vanished. A massive chunk of the unstable limestone ledge sheared right off the face of the mountain. Gravity seized me instantly. I dropped straight down. The safety harness violently jerked around my waist, knocking the wind completely out of my lungs. I slammed hard against the vertical rock face, scraping the side of my cheek on the coarse stone. I was dangling 15 feet below the safe ledge, suspended over an 80-foot drop into a jagged canopy of ancient Douglas firs and massive granite boulders. But I was alive. The rope held. The anchor held. I took a ragged breath, the adrenaline making my entire body shake uncontrollably. "Caroline!" I yelled, my voice hoarse and desperate. "Caroline." I slipped. "You need to secure the winch. Lock the ascender so I can climb up." I waited for the panicked face of my wife of 24 years to appear over the edge. I waited for her to scream my name, to rush to the winch system we had practiced using at the base of the trail. Nothing happened. The wind just kept howling through the gorge. "Caroline!" I shouted, louder, panic finally starting to creep into my chest. "Are you hurt? Talk to me." Then her face appeared over the lip of the rock. She was not crying anymore. The absolute terror I had seen in her eyes just moments before, when I was pulling her up, was completely gone. Her expression was utterly blank. It was a cold, empty, dead stare that I had never seen in my life. She looked down at me the way you look at a stranger passing by on the street, or the way you look at an insect you are about to step on. She stood up slowly, her shadow falling over me. I heard the distinct metallic click of a heavy carabiner unlatching. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Lock the line! The tension is slipping." Caroline reached into the tactical belt around her waist. She bypassed the extra carabiners and the chalk bag. Her hand closed around the thick, black rubber handle of her survival knife. She pulled it smoothly from the sheath. The serrated steel caught the pale afternoon sunlight glinting brightly against the gray rock. My brain absolutely refused to process the image. This was the woman I took to church every Sunday morning. This was the woman who had held my hand in the hospital waiting room when my father passed away. This was the mother of my children. She knelt right at the edge of the cliff, bringing the highly sharpened, serrated edge of the blade directly against the taut, yellow climbing rope that was keeping me alive. I searched her face for madness, for a sudden psychotic break, for absolutely anything that would excuse what I was seeing. But there was nothing. Her eyes were clear-focused and completely sane. It was a business transaction. "Caroline, stop," I begged. The profound confusion in my mind was far worse than the raw fear of falling. "What are you doing?" "It is me. It is Thomas, please." She paused for a fraction of a second, looking directly into my eyes. There was no hesitation. There was no remorse. "I am sorry, Thomas," she said. Her voice was completely steady, cold as ice, and barely loud enough to be heard over the rushing wind. "But Bradley needs the capital." She sawed the heavy blade back and forth across the tensioned nylon. The sound was sickening. It was a tight, high-pitched ripping noise as the inner core threads began to snap one by one under the immense pressure of my body weight. "Pop, pop, pop, Caroline, please!" I screamed, clawing desperately at the sheer rock face, trying to find a handhold, trying to pull my own weight up the fraying line. But the rock was smooth, wet slate. My fingers found no purchase. The rope began to fray rapidly, the yellow fibers curling outward. She did not look away. She maintained eye contact with me, watching my face as she applied more downward pressure to the blade. Pop, pop. The final strand of yellow nylon gave way. The sudden loss of tension was a massive physical shock. The world violently shifted upward as gravity took total control of my body. The rush of wind roared in my ears, deafening and absolute. I was falling. Time stretched into an agonizing, horrific crawl. I saw the gray cliff face rushing past my eyes in a blur. I saw the dark green canopy of the ancient pine trees rushing up to meet me from the depths of the gorge. I tried to brace myself, putting my arms out, but there is no bracing for an 80-foot drop. There is only the wait for the end. I hit the tree canopy first. Thick, heavy branches the size of baseball bats whipped violently against my body, snapping against my ribs and tearing right through my heavy hiking clothes. The brutal impacts spun me like a rag doll. A thick, unyielding branch struck the side of my helmet, cracking the hard plastic completely open and sending a shockwave of white-hot pain through my skull. The dense trees slowed my descent slightly, but they could not stop it. I crashed through the final layer of pine needles and slammed directly into the unforgiving forest floor. The impact sounded like a shotgun going off inside my own head. The breath was violently expelled from my lungs in a bloody mist. A sickening wet crunch echoed through my lower half as my legs absorbed the brutal brunt of the landing on a bed of solid granite rocks. My ribs shattered inward, piercing my side. The pain was not just physical. It was a blinding, absolute white light that consumed my entire consciousness. I lay there in the damp earth, staring up at the sky, completely unable to move a single millimeter of my body. Blood filled my mouth, tasting like heavy copper and dirt. Every breath was a jagged knife in my chest. My vision began to tunnel, rapidly closing in with dark, fuzzy edges. High above me, through the broken branches of the pine trees, I could barely make out the small gray lip of the cliff. A tiny silhouette stood at the edge, looking down at my broken body for a long moment. Then the silhouette turned around and walked away, leaving me to die alone in the dirt. The freezing cold seeped deep into my shattered bones. The darkness pulled me under, and I closed my eyes, letting the blackness take me entirely. The relentless mechanical hiss of a ventilator was the first thing that dragged me back from the void. It was a sterile, rhythmic sound that offered no comfort, only the cold reality that I was still breathing. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt like they were sealed shut with wet sand. When I finally forced them apart, the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit blinded me. Pain did not come immediately. It arrived in waves, a suffocating, crushing tide that swallowed every nerve ending in my body. I tried to turn my head to take in my surroundings, but I hit a rigid, unyielding barrier. Metal. Cold, heavy metal. Panic surged through my chest as I realized a titanium halo brace was physically screwed into my skull, locking my neck and spine in absolute terrifying alignment. My arms were heavily casted, resting like dead concrete logs on the crisp hospital sheets. Both of my legs were immobilized, suspended in rigid traction gear. I was trapped inside my own broken shell. The fog of the medically induced coma began to clear, and with it came the horrific flood of memories. The screaming wind in the Columbia River gorge, the burning strain in my shoulders as I hauled my wife over the crumbling limestone edge. The dead, empty look in Caroline's eyes as she pulled that black-handled survival knife from her belt. The sickening sound of the nylon fibers ripping apart. The endless, terrifying plunge into the dark green canopy. A monitor next to my bed began to blare a rapid, high-pitched alarm, betraying my skyrocketing heart rate. A nurse in blue scrubs hurried into my line of sight, placing a warm hand on my casted arm. She spoke in soft, soothing tones, telling me I was at a regional trauma center, that I had been in a coma for 3 days, and that I was lucky to be alive. I tried to speak, but my throat was painfully dry, scraped raw by the intubation tube that had recently been removed. I managed only a pathetic, raspy croak. I needed to tell her. I needed to scream that the woman sitting in the waiting room was a monster. Before I could force the words out, the sliding glass door to my room opened. A man stepped inside. He wore a rumpled gray suit, that looked like he had slept in it, and his face carried the heavy, exhausted lines of someone who had seen too much human tragedy. He held up a silver badge to the nurse, murmuring a quiet instruction for her to give us the room. The nurse hesitated, checking my vitals one last time before slipping out and pulling the heavy glass door shut behind her. The man walked to the foot of my bed, his dark eyes studying my shattered frame. "My name is Detective Miller," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I am the lead investigator on your case, Thomas. You took a hell of a fall. The search and rescue team said it was a miracle the pine branches caught you the way they did." I swallowed hard, fighting the agonizing sandpaper scrape in my throat. I forced my vocal cords to work, pushing every ounce of air I had left into forming a coherent sentence. "She did it," I rasped, the words tearing at my throat. "Carolyn, my wife! She cut the rope. You have to arrest her. She tried to kill me." I expected the detective to look shocked. I expected him to pull out a notepad and frantically write down my accusation. Instead, Miller let out a long, heavy sigh. He did not look surprised. He looked profoundly tired. He stepped closer to the side of my bed, reaching into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. "Save your strength," Thomas Miller said quietly. "We know." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words. "When your wife called 911, she gave the dispatchers a flawless, hysterical performance." Miller continued, his tone flat and analytical. "She told the authorities it was a tragic hiking accident. She claimed you lost your footing while securing the anchor, and that the safety line frayed against the sharp rock face. It was a very clean story, but my team went over the cliff edge. We found the cleanly severed end of the nylon rope. Nylon does not snap with a perfectly clean edge from friction, Thomas. It frays. Your rope was sliced clean through with a serrated blade. Relief washed over me, a brief, fleeting comfort. They knew. The nightmare was going to be over. They were going to lock her away for the rest of her life. But then Miller pulled a clear plastic evidence bag from his pocket. Inside the bag was a folded piece of crisp white paper. It was a standard itemized receipt, the kind you get from any high-end corporate office. He held it up so I could read the bold black logo printed across the top header. It was the name of an upscale premium funeral home located just 10 miles from my house in the suburbs. I read the itemized lines printed beneath the logo, and my blood ran completely cold. The receipt listed a premium solid oak casket with brass fittings. It listed a fully catered memorial service package. It listed the exact coordinates for a premium burial plot in the local cemetery. The total bill came out to slightly over $18,000, paid in full, paid in cash. We executed a quiet search warrant on Caroline's luxury SUV. While she was sitting in the surgical waiting room, Miller explained, his eyes never leaving mine. "We found this tucked inside the leather glove box manual. Look at the timestamp at the bottom of the page, Thomas. Look at the date." I dragged my eyes to the bottom of the receipt. The date and time were printed in stark, undeniable black ink. The transaction had been completed on Thursday morning at exactly 9:15. Thursday morning. The hike where I was thrown off the cliff took place on Friday afternoon. The sheer calculated horror of that printed timestamp hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My mind, trained by decades of running logistics and supply chains, instantly processed the brutal reality of what I was looking at. This was not a momentary lapse of sanity on the cliff edge. This was not a crime of passion committed in the heat of an argument. This was a fully premeditated, scheduled delivery. While I was spending my Thursday evening carefully inspecting our climbing harnesses, desperately hoping this weekend trip would fix our broken marriage, my wife of 24 years was picking out the wood grain for my coffin. She had paid for my burial 24 hours before she even handed me the map to the hiking trail. Bradley needed the capital for his failing real estate development, and Caroline had decided that my life insurance policy was the most efficient way to balance their ledgers. I was nothing more than a liquidated asset. "Then arrest her," I choked out tears of absolute rage burning the corners of my eyes. "Arrest her right now. You have the proof. You have the severed rope. You have the funeral receipt. What are you waiting for?" Miller lowered the evidence bag, his face tightening with a mixture of anger and deep professional frustration. "It is not that simple, Thomas," he said, his voice dropping to a low, cautious murmur. "We tried to bring her in for formal questioning yesterday. Within 20 minutes, a team of high-powered corporate defense attorneys showed up at the precinct. They were paid for by your brother-in-law, Bradley. Do you know what their official statement was regarding this receipt?" I could only stare at him, my breathing shallow and erratic. "They claimed the funeral arrangements were for Caroline's elderly mother," Miller explained bitterly. "Her mother is currently residing in a high-level assisted living facility with severe heart failure. The lawyers provided documents proving the mother's declining health. They stated that Caroline, being a proactive and grieving daughter, simply wanted to secure the final arrangements in advance to spare the family the logistical pain later." "But the plot," I whispered frantically. "The casket, it was for me." "They are arguing it was a clerical error by the funeral director," Miller replied, shaking his head. "They claim the director mistakenly put your name on the internal file draft instead of the mother's name, and that Carolyn was too emotionally distressed to notice the error when she paid the bill. It is a massive convenient lie. We know it is a lie. You know it is a lie. But in a court of law with Bradley throwing unlimited money at defense experts, a slick lawyer can introduce just enough reasonable doubt to a jury. We cannot arrest her for premeditated attempted murder based on a receipt that her lawyers have already legally explained away as a paperwork mistake." The walls of the hospital room felt like they were closing in on me. The immense weight of the injustice was suffocating. I had spent my entire adult life providing for that woman. I had funded her brother's reckless dreams. I had pulled her from the edge of a cliff, tearing my own muscles to save her life. And she had countered my devotion with a team of lawyers and an ironclad alibi. What about the rope? I demanded, my voice gaining a desperate, frantic edge. "You said the rope was cut. We are running forensic analysis on the nylon fibers right now," Miller said, gripping the edge of my bed railing. "But her legal team is already spinning a narrative that the climbing gear was faulty, or that it snapped cleanly across a razor-sharp piece of shale during your fall. Thomas, you have to understand the legal reality we are facing. You are a wealthy man. Bradley's luxury development is bleeding millions. They are desperate, and desperate people with money know how to manipulate the justice system. We are building a case, but it takes time. Time to gather undeniable hard evidence that no expensive lawyer can wave away." I closed my eyes, a single tear escaping and sliding down my cheek, stinging the abrasions on my face. I was completely paralyzed, locked in a metal halo, staring down the barrel of a legal nightmare. "And there is something else you need to be prepared for." Miller continued, his tone turning incredibly grim. "Something much worse than the investigation timeline." I opened my eyes and looked at him. What could possibly be worse than knowing my wife scheduled my execution? "She is your legal spouse," Thomas Miller said quietly. "And because of the severe nature of your injuries and the temporary coma you were just in, Caroline currently holds your full medical power of attorney." The words struck me with the force of a freight train. Medical power of attorney. She was in absolute control of my health care. She dictated my visitors. She dictated my treatments. The woman who just tried to drop me into a gorge was officially in charge of my recovery. "We tried to block it," Miller added quickly, seeing the sheer terror erupt in my eyes. "I brought a judge down here yesterday to try and strip her of her medical rights based on our ongoing criminal suspicion. But without a formal indictment, the judge refused to override standard marital legal rights. Bradley brought in a private doctor who testified that Caroline is a devoted, traumatized wife, fully capable of managing your care. Legally, my hands are tied until I can secure a warrant for her arrest. I can station an officer outside the ICU ward, but I cannot stop her from walking into this room. As if summoned by the very mention of her name, the heavy glass door of the hospital room slid open. Caroline walked in. She was dressed in a conservative dark navy sweater and tailored slacks. Her hair was perfectly arranged, pulled back into a neat, elegant clasp. She held a crumpled tissue in her hand, her eyes slightly red and puffy, presenting the absolute perfect image of a terrified, grieving wife who had barely slept in days. 2 floor nurses followed closely behind her, looking at her with deep sympathy and offering quiet words of comfort. "Oh, Thomas!" Caroline gasped, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. She rushed to the side of my bed, her hands hovering over my casted arms as if she were afraid to hurt me. "Thank God. Thank God you are awake. I have been out of my mind with worry." She turned to look at Detective Miller, her expression shifting instantly from a grieving widow to an indignant protective spouse. "Detective, I was told my husband was finally conscious," she said, her tone dripping with polite but firm authority. "The doctor said he needs absolute rest. I do not appreciate you interrogating him while he is in this vulnerable state. I am his medical proxy, and I am asking you to leave my husband alone." Miller's jaw tightened. He looked at me, a silent promise burning in his dark eyes before turning back to Caroline. "I was just checking on his recovery, ma'am," Miller said coldly. "We will be speaking again very soon." Miller walked out of the room, the heavy glass door sliding shut behind him. The nurses lingered for a moment, adjusting my IV drips and checking the monitors before quietly excusing themselves to give us privacy. The second the door clicked shut, and we were completely alone, the performance ended. The tearful, trembling facade vanished so fast, it made my stomach turn. Carolyn dropped the crumpled tissue into a nearby waste bin. She stood perfectly straight, smoothing out the front of her expensive navy sweater. She walked slowly to the head of my bed, moving out of the line of sight of the hallway window. She leaned down, bringing her face just inches from mine. I could smell the familiar, expensive vanilla perfume I had bought her for our anniversary last year. Her eyes were exactly as they had been on the cliff, dead cold and calculating. "I watched you fall." "Thomas," she whispered, her voice a soft, venomous hiss directly in my ear. "I watched you hit the trees. You should have died down there in the dirt. It would have been so clean. The insurance payout would have cleared Bradley's construction debts by Tuesday. But you always had to be the stubborn one. You always had to make things difficult." I stared up at her, trapped inside the rigid metal halo, entirely unable to move away from her. "You will not get away with this!" I rasped, my throat burning. "The police know. They have the receipt." Caroline let out a low, mocking laugh. It was a sound devoid of any humanity. "The police have a piece of paper and a wild story from a man with severe head trauma," she whispered, tracing a manicured fingernail lightly over the cold titanium bar bolted to my skull. "Bradley's lawyers are already drafting the paperwork. We are telling the court that your fall caused irreversible paranoid delusions. We are telling everyone you have lost your mind. Nobody is going to believe a broken man over his devoted, heartbroken wife." She stood back up, adjusting her purse on her shoulder with a casual, sickening grace. "You survived the fall, Thomas," she said, looking down at me with absolute contempt. "But you have no money, you have no mobility, and very soon you will have no voice. Since you refuse to do us the favor of dying on that mountain, I will just have to destroy you the legal way." Rumors move with terrifying speed in affluent suburban neighborhoods. They move even faster when they are carefully packaged as humble prayer requests. While I was bolted to a hospital bed, physically trapped inside a titanium halo brace, and breathing the sterile, filtered air of the intensive care unit, my wife was busy standing at the pulpit of our community church. I did not get to witness her performance firsthand, but the devastating shockwaves of her lies reached my hospital room within days. Caroline wore a modest, dark-tailored dress. She stood before the congregation we had tithed to for 2 decades, weeping softly into a tissue. She told our friends, our neighbors, and our spiritual leaders that her beloved husband had suffered a tragic, clumsy accident on a hiking trail. She painted a beautiful, heartbreaking picture of a desperate rescue attempt, claiming she tried with all her strength to hold the rope, but simply could not bear my weight. Then she delivered the killing blow to my reputation. She tearfully explained that my 80-foot fall had caused catastrophic swelling in my frontal lobe. She told the crowded sanctuary that my brain was bleeding, that I was experiencing severe, violent, paranoid delusions, and that I was falsely accusing her of trying to murder me. She asked for their prayers, their privacy, and their absolute discretion during this agonizing chapter of her life. She effectively inoculated herself against the truth. By the time I could speak a coherent sentence, my reality had already been entirely rewritten by the woman who cut my safety line. The profound isolation set in a day later when Pastor Gregory came to visit the trauma ward. He was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair, someone I had played golf with countless times. He walked into my room holding a leather-bound Bible, his face arranged in a mask of deep, condescending pity. I felt a desperate surge of hope. This was a man I trusted, a man who had counseled my family for years. "Pastor," I rasped the words, scraping like sandpaper against my healing throat. "You have to listen to me. Caroline is lying. She took a hunting knife to my rope. She looked right at me and sawed through the nylon. She wants me dead. You have to go to the police. You have to tell them she is a danger to me." Pastor Gregory did not pull out his phone. He did not look alarmed. Instead, he let out a long, heavy sigh and placed his warm, soft hand over my casted wrist. He looked at me the exact same way you would look at an elderly relative suffering from advanced dementia. "Oh, Thomas," he murmured, his voice adopting that slow, loud cadence reserved for toddlers and the dying. "Caroline warned me you might say these things. She told me the doctors expect these vivid, terrifying nightmares. You suffered a massive trauma to your head, my friend. Your mind is simply trying to make sense of the horrific accident. You need to rest. You need to let the medicine work. Carolyn loves you so much. She has not stopped crying since Friday." I stared at him in absolute horror. The realization crashed down on me like a physical weight. I was screaming the absolute truth, but my words were completely neutralized. Every frantic accusation I made only served as further proof of my fabricated brain injury. "I am not delusional," I begged, my heart monitor beginning to beep rapidly. I saw her do it. She told me her brother needed capital. She bought a casket for me. "Shh, Thomas, please calm down," Pastor Gregory said, stepping back slightly, his eyes flashing with a brief hint of alarm at my rising agitation. "Do not agitate your healing process. We are all praying for your mental clarity." He left a few minutes later, leaving me drowning in a suffocating sea of panic. I begged the day shift nurses to dial my phone to hold the receiver to my ear so I could call my closest friends. I called Bill, the man who had stood as the best man at my wedding. It went straight to voicemail. I called my lead logistics manager, a guy I had mentored for 10 years. Voicemail. I called the neighbors we hosted for summer barbecues every July. Nothing but the cold, automated tone of a recording. Caroline had sealed me off from the outside world. She had systematically reached out to every contact in my phone, warning them that answering my calls would only fuel my paranoid delusions. She instructed them to ignore my frantic messages for my own medical good. I was completely erased. A living ghost trapped inside a shattered shell. But the social assassination was merely the smokescreen for the main event. Caroline needed to strip me of my credibility to execute the ultimate legal ambush. 2 days later, a sharp, suited attorney walked into my intensive care room. He did not introduce himself politely. He simply dropped a thick manila folder onto the rolling tray table beside my bed. He informed me that under state law, due to my severe physical incapacitation and documented psychological instability, a probate judge had granted an emergency ex parte guardianship order. I did not even get a hearing. Caroline had submitted sworn affidavits from private doctors paid for by her brother, claiming my traumatic brain injury rendered me entirely unfit to manage my own affairs. With the stroke of a judge's pen, I lost my fundamental human rights. I was legally reduced to the status of an infant. Caroline was granted absolute unchecked authority over my medical decisions, my property, and my financial assets. I was a man who had built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, and overnight I was legally forbidden from signing a check or choosing my own pain medication. The sheer terror of that legal guillotine dropping was worse than the 80-foot fall. She had me exactly where she wanted me. I was entirely at her mercy. I spent 2 nights staring at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, unable to sleep, consumed by a burning, furious need to know the exact extent of the damage. Why did Bradley need capital so desperately that his sister would commit murder? How much had they already taken? I needed access to the outside world. My salvation came in the form of a night shift nurse named Sarah. She was a quiet, observant woman who had been changing my IV bags since I woke up. Unlike the other staff, she never looked at me with pity. She looked at me with genuine, careful curiosity. She had seen the way Caroline acted when the doctors were not in the room. She had noticed the complete absence of genuine warmth. On the 3rd night of my legal captivity, I waited until the ward was completely silent. Sarah came in to check my vitals. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice desperate and raw. "I am not crazy. I am not delusional. I know what they put in my chart, but I am begging you to look into my eyes and see the truth. My wife is going to kill me, and she is using this hospital to keep me trapped. I need a phone she does not know about. I will pay you back 10 times whatever it costs. Just please help me." Sarah stopped adjusting the fluid line. She stood frozen in the dim glow of the medical monitors. She looked at the door, then back at me. She did not say a word. She finished her rounds and left the room. For 3 agonizing hours, I thought I had failed. I thought she was going to report me to the psychiatric unit. But just before her shift ended at 6 in the morning, Sarah slipped back into my room. She reached into her scrub pocket and quickly slid a cheap plastic prepaid smartphone under my heavy blanket right next to my casted right hand. Her fingers brushed mine, offering a brief, silent squeeze of solidarity before she hurried out the door. My right hand was severely fractured, bound in thick fiberglass, leaving only my thumb and index finger free. It took an excruciating amount of effort just to grip the small device. Every slight movement sent a shockwave of agony up my arm and into my shattered ribs. But the burning need for the truth pushed me through the pain. I navigated the clunky browser on the small screen, typing in the web address for my primary wealth management portal. My breathing hitched as I typed in my complex passwords, desperately praying my access had not yet been revoked. The screen loaded. The 2-factor authentication prompt popped up, demanding a code sent to my personal cell phone, which Caroline currently had in her purse. Panic flared, but my logistics training kicked in. I always built redundancies into my systems. I selected the backup verification option, answering 3 highly specific security questions that only I knew the answers to. The loading circle spun for what felt like an eternity. Then the dashboard illuminated the small screen. I stared at the glowing numbers, my heart completely stopping in my chest. My primary checking account, which usually held enough working capital to cover 6 months of household and business expenses, was completely drained. The balance was $64. I frantically tapped the screen with my exposed thumb, navigating to my Vanguard investment portfolio. I had spent 2 decades aggressively funding my retirement. It was the absolute pride of my financial life, a fully diversified account sitting at just over $1.2 million. It was my safety net, my legacy. The current balance read 0. A cold, heavy numbness washed over my entire body. I pulled up the recent transaction history, my eyes scanning the digital ledger. The liquidation had not happened overnight. It had been happening in massive, aggressive chunks over the last 4 weeks. Caroline had forged my electronic signatures, bypassed our joint security protocols, and completely liquidated my life savings. But the money had to go somewhere. I traced the wire transfers. Every single dollar, every liquidated stock, every piece of equity I had bled to build was funneled directly into a holding company registered under the name Oak Ridge Development Group. Bradley. I knew the name of the LLC. It was the corporate entity Bradley had created for his massive, highly publicized luxury condominium project on the edge of the county. He had promised his elite investors a revolutionary, eco-friendly gated community. But I knew his supply chain was an absolute disaster. I knew his contractors were threatening to walk off the job due to unpaid invoices. Bradley was drowning in tens of millions of dollars of toxic debt, and the bank was threatening to foreclose on his entire commercial portfolio. The sickening, horrific picture finally snapped into perfect clarity. Caroline did not just cut my rope because she was tired of our marriage. She cut my rope because she and Bradley had already stolen everything I owned. They had forged my name on high-interest collateral loans, leveraging my house, my business, and my retirement to inject emergency liquidity into Bradley's failing real estate empire. If I discovered the massive financial fraud, I would have sent them both to federal prison for decades. They knew my auditing schedule. They knew I reviewed my quarterly portfolios on the first of every month. I was scheduled to discover the missing money in exactly 3 days. That was why she suggested the hiking trip. That was why she booked the funeral casket 24 hours in advance. I was never supposed to leave that mountain. My death would have completely erased the trail of their financial crimes, as my widow Carolyn would have legally inherited the empty accounts, quietly written off the missing funds as a tragic loss, and collected my massive life insurance policy to cover the rest of Bradley's debts. I dropped the prepaid phone onto the mattress, my chest heaving against the tight constrictions of the halo brace. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was beyond human comprehension. They had stripped me of my mobility. They had stripped me of my reputation. They had stripped me of every single dollar I had ever earned. I was lying in a hospital bed, entirely broken, surrounded by a community that believed I was a paranoid lunatic, while the woman who tried to murder me slept comfortably in my bed, spending my money to save her brother. The despair was suffocating. I wanted to close my eyes and just let the monitor flatline. I wanted to give up. But as I stared at the dark ceiling of the intensive care unit, the despair slowly began to curdle into something else. It hardened. It crystallized. The shock faded away, leaving behind a cold, absolute, and terrifying rage. Caroline and Bradley thought they had executed the perfect crime. They thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They thought they had pushed me to the absolute bottom of the abyss. They were wrong. Because when you push a man to the absolute bottom, you give him the hardest foundation in the world to stand on. The jarring rattle of the medical transport van was a physical torture. Every pothole and uneven stretch of asphalt sent agonizing shockwaves up my shattered spine and directly into the titanium screws bolted into my skull. I was strapped upright in a specialized wheelchair, heavily medicated, and entirely powerless. They did not take me back to the comfortable suburban home I had paid for. They took me straight to the county courthouse. The transition from the sterile quiet of the intensive care unit to the bustling, echoing halls of the probate court was violently disorienting. I was wheeled into a sprawling courtroom filled with polished mahogany benches and the heavy scent of floor wax. I could barely turn my head inside the rigid confines of the halo brace, but I did not need to look around to know I was walking into an ambush. Caroline sat at the plaintiff table looking like the picture of absolute tragic devotion. She wore a modest gray suit, her hands clasped tightly together, her posture radiating exhaustion and deep sorrow. Sitting right beside her was her brother, Bradley. He wore a custom-tailored Navy suit projecting the image of a successful, protective family man who had dropped everything to support his grieving sister. Next to them sat a legal team that looked like a pack of apex predators. They were led by a high-priced corporate litigator whose hourly rate was likely being paid directly from my stolen retirement accounts. I was wheeled to the respondent table by a court-appointed bailiff. I had no lawyer present. Caroline had utilized her medical power of attorney to intercept all my communications, ensuring I had absolutely zero legal representation for this emergency hearing. I was a lamb placed directly on the slaughtering block. The Honorable Judge Patricia Collins presided over the chamber. She looked down from her high bench with a severe, evaluating gaze. The proceedings began with a swift, brutal efficiency that left me completely breathless. Caroline's lead attorney stood up and addressed the court, his voice echoing with practiced theatrical empathy. "Your Honor," the attorney began, smoothing his silk tie. "We are here today under the most tragic and desperate of circumstances. My client Caroline is seeking emergency ex parte guardianship over her husband Thomas. 2 weeks ago, Thomas suffered a catastrophic 80-foot fall during a recreational hike. By the grace of God, he survived the physical impact. However, the severe trauma to his frontal lobe has left him with profound, irreversible cognitive damage." I tried to speak up. I opened my mouth to shout that he was lying to tell the judge that Caroline had intentionally severed my climbing rope. But my throat was still completely raw from the medical intubation, and my voice emerged as a weak, pathetic croak. The judge raised a hand, instructing me gently but firmly to remain silent until I was recognized. The attorney did not even miss a beat. He simply gestured toward me with an open, pitying palm, using my frantic interruption as immediate evidence for his fabricated narrative. "As you can see, Your Honor," the attorney continued, his voice dropping to a somber whisper. "Thomas is experiencing highly volatile, aggressive, paranoid delusions. He has repeatedly accused my client, the woman who has stood by his side for 24 years, of attempting to murder him on that mountain. He has harassed the hospital staff with wild conspiracy theories about stolen finances and funeral plots. His mental state is deteriorating rapidly. He is a clear and present danger to his own physical recovery and financial stability." The attorney then approached the bench and handed the judge a massive 3-inch thick binder. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction. Caroline and Bradley had spared absolutely no expense. The binder contained heavily edited psychiatric evaluations from private doctors on Bradley's payroll. These doctors had visited my hospital room while I was heavily sedated, asking me leading questions and twisting my groggy responses into a terrifying diagnosis of permanent traumatic psychosis. The documents claimed I lacked the basic executive function to handle a bank account, manage a household, or direct my own medical care. I looked over at Caroline. She lifted a perfectly pressed white handkerchief to her eyes, dabbing at tears that did not exist. Bradley placed a comforting arm around her shoulders. He then stood up and asked the judge for permission to speak. "Your Honor," Bradley said, his voice thick with manufactured grief. "Thomas has been like a brother to me for decades. He built an amazing company from the ground up. He was a brilliant logistics broker. Seeing him like this, seeing his mind so completely broken by this accident, it is destroying our family. Caroline has not slept a full night since the fall. She is utterly terrified of what Thomas might do to himself if he is left unsupervised. We just want to keep him safe. We just want to protect the life he worked so hard to build. It was the most sickening performance I had ever witnessed in my entire life." Bradley was standing in a court of law, swearing under oath to protect the very wealth he had already stolen from me to fund his bankrupt luxury real estate project. He was using the legal system to lock the doors to my own vault. I finally managed to force a full sentence out of my ruined throat. I gripped the armrests of my wheelchair, ignoring the blinding pain in my shattered ribs. Judge Collins. I begged, my voice echoing across the silent courtroom. Please look at my accounts. They forged my signature. They drained my retirement. Caroline cut my safety line. You have to order an audit. Judge Collins looked down at me. There was no anger in her eyes, nor was there any suspicion. There was only a deep, heartbreaking pity. It was the exact same look my pastor had given me in the intensive care unit. She had already read the thick binder. She had already digested the fabricated medical narrative. To her, I was not a victim of a massive financial conspiracy. I was just a brain-damaged man suffering from violent, tragic hallucinations. Thomas, I understand you are deeply confused and in a tremendous amount of pain right now, Judge Collins said softly. But the medical evidence presented to this court is overwhelming and conclusive. Your brain has suffered a massive trauma. You are not capable of managing your affairs at this time. I am granting full temporary legal and medical guardianship to your wife, Caroline. She will have complete executive authority over your estate, your bank accounts, and your rehabilitation plan until further notice. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. In a matter of 20 minutes, the entire foundation of my existence was legally demolished. I was 54 years old, and I officially had fewer civil rights than a toddler. Caroline held the signed court order in her manicured hand. She owned my name. She owned my business equity. She owned my life. But the nightmare was not over. Caroline immediately stepped forward to address the judge one final time. Your Honor, Caroline said, her voice steady and deeply respectful. Our primary residence is a large, multi-level suburban home with steep staircases and hardwood floors. The medical specialists have advised me that it is an incredibly dangerous environment for a man with a halo brace and shattered legs. Furthermore, being in the city exposes Thomas to far too much sensory stimulation, which the doctors say triggers his paranoid episodes. For the sake of his rehabilitation, I am moving him to a secure, quiet, rural property owned by his family. It will give him the absolute peace and isolation he needs to heal his broken mind. The judge nodded approvingly, commending Caroline for her proactive and selfless medical planning. I felt the last drop of blood drain from my face. She was legally evicting me from the $1.5 million home I had purchased with my own blood and sweat. She was throwing me out of the house where I had raised my children, the house with the custom kitchen we had designed together, the house with the manicured lawn, and the safe, friendly neighbors. I was no longer welcome on my own property. The court officers wheeled me out of the room. I was pushed through the double doors and loaded directly into a private medical transport van, waiting by the rear loading dock. Caroline and Bradley followed right behind me. They did not ride in the back with me. They sat up front, separated from my wheelchair by a heavy metal grate. The engine roared to life, and we drove away from the courthouse. I sat in the dim light of the transport van, watching the familiar streets of my beautiful suburban neighborhood pass by the small tinted window. We merged onto the highway, driving further and further away from civilization. The paved roads slowly turned into cracked, neglected asphalt. The upscale shopping centers and manicured parks gave way to empty fields, rusted chain-link fences, and deep, silent woods. We were driving into a forgotten, impoverished rural county located nearly 3 hours away from the city. I knew exactly where they were taking me. 15 years ago, my father passed away and left me a 40-acre plot of agricultural land deep in the rural valley. It used to be a thriving, beautiful apple orchard. But 10 years ago, a massive, uncontrollable wildfire swept through the canyon. The blaze decimated the entire property, burning every single tree down to a charred, blackened stump. The fire ruined the topsoil, rendering the land completely useless for modern farming. The only thing that survived the blaze was a rusted-out, dilapidated, double-wide trailer sitting on concrete cinder blocks at the very edge of the dirt property line. I had kept the deed purely for sentimental reasons, paying the minimal yearly property taxes out of pocket. It was the only asset Carolyn did not bother transferring into Bradley's holding company simply because she deemed it utterly worthless. The van turned off the main county road and crunched onto a long, overgrown gravel driveway. The suspension bounced violently over deep, washed-out ruts in the dirt. We pulled up to the center of the dead 40 acres. The scene was absolute desolation. Thousands of dead, black tree stumps stretched out like tombstones across the scorched, uneven dirt. The sky above was a heavy, oppressive gray. Sitting in the middle of this wasteland was the double-wide trailer. The aluminum siding was faded and peeling away in jagged strips. The front screen door hung loosely off a single rusted hinge. Thick, thorny weeds grew wildly up the sides of the concrete blocks, holding the structure off the ground. There was no running water hooked up to the county line. The only heat source was a black cast iron wood stove sitting in the center of a rotted living room. The transport driver opened the rear doors and lowered the mechanical ramp. Caroline and Bradley stepped out onto the dead dirt. They did not even bother pretending to be sad anymore. There were no cameras here. There were no judges to impress. The driver unhooked my wheelchair and rolled me heavily down the metal ramp. He pushed me toward the crumbling wooden steps of the trailer and locked the brakes. He then pulled a single cheap canvas duffel bag from the front seat and dropped it in the dirt next to my wheels. It contained 3 sets of cheap sweatpants, a few basic toiletries, and absolutely nothing else. That was the entire sum of my worldly possessions. Caroline stood a few feet away, wrapping her expensive designer coat tightly around her shoulders against the biting rural wind. She looked at the rusted trailer with deep, unfiltered disgust, and then she looked at me with exactly the same expression. She did not say a single word. She just turned around and walked back to the passenger side of the transport van. Bradley lingered behind. He walked slowly over to my wheelchair, his highly polished leather dress shoes crunching against the dead gravel. He looked out over the endless acres of burnt, worthless stumps, and then he looked down at my shattered, immobilized body trapped inside the titanium halo brace. A slow, cruel, and victorious smile spread across his face. "Enjoy your inheritance," Thomas Bradley sneered, leaning in close so I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You die out here, the state takes it. We already took everything else." He patted me hard on my uncasted shoulder, turned on his heel, and walked away. The doors of the transport van slammed shut. The engine roared and the heavy tires kicked up a thick cloud of gray dust as the vehicle sped away down the ruined driveway. I was left completely alone in the freezing wind. I sat in a wheelchair I could barely operate, staring at a rotting trailer that smelled of mildew and decay. I had no money. I had no telephone. I had no legal rights. I was 54 years old, entirely broken and abandoned in the middle of a dead wasteland. Caroline and Bradley had successfully stripped away my entire existence. They had banished me to the dirt, fully expecting me to quietly wither away and die in the shadows, leaving them to enjoy the millions they had stolen. They thought this scorched earth was my graveyard. They had absolutely no idea what was buried beneath it. The silence of the rural valley was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and designed to break whatever spirit I had left. When I woke up the first morning inside that decaying double-wide trailer, the temperature had dropped below freezing. My breath formed thick white clouds in the stale air. I lay on a stained, sagging mattress that offered zero support for my shattered ribs. The metal halo brace bolted into my skull felt like a block of solid ice pulling my head down into the worn fabric. I was 54 years old, a man who had built a logistics empire from scratch, and now my entire universe was confined to a rusted tin box sitting on cinder blocks. Caroline and Bradley had engineered this banishment perfectly. They knew I was physically incapacitated. They assumed the sheer logistical nightmare of staying alive out here would finish the job the 80-foot fall had started. There was no running water. The plumbing had frozen and burst years ago. My only source of heat was a massive black cast-iron wood stove sitting in the center of the living room, surrounded by a pile of dry kindling some previous squatter had left behind. Just getting out of the wheelchair was a grueling battle against my own broken anatomy. It took me 45 minutes of agonizing effort simply to transfer my weight from the canvas seat to a battered wooden chair next to the stove. My casted arm throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. My shattered legs sent shooting spikes of white-hot agony up my spine with every minor adjustment. I struck a match with my good hand, my fingers trembling violently from the cold, and watched the dry wood catch fire. The small orange flames danced behind the iron grate, casting long, flickering shadows against the peeling aluminum walls. Breakfast was a cold can of generic chicken noodle soup. I pried the lid open with a rusted screwdriver I found on the kitchen counter and ate it directly from the tin. The metallic taste coated my tongue, a bitter reminder of exactly how far I had fallen. They wanted me to rot here. They wanted me to stare out the cracked windows at 40 acres of dead, burnt apple trees and accept that my life was entirely over. They wanted me to believe that my existence was as barren as the scorched earth outside. But they miscalculated. They forgot that my entire career was built on solving impossible logistical nightmares. I did not know how to quit. I only knew how to adapt. The anger started as a small, quiet ember in the pit of my stomach. Every time I looked at the cheap canvas duffel bag Caroline had packed for me, the ember flared. Every time I remembered Bradley adjusting his custom suit and sneering about the state taking my inheritance, the heat spread through my chest. By the second week of my isolation, that anger had completely consumed me. It became my fuel. It became my absolute obsession. I refused to die in that trailer. I refused to let them win. My rehabilitation became a brutal, solitary crusade. Without access to doctors or specialized physical therapists, I had to invent my own recovery protocols. I found an old, sturdy wooden cane leaning in the corner of a closet, heavily worn at the handle. It became my lifeline. I forced myself to stand, bracing my good arm against the kitchen counter while my broken legs screamed in protest. The pain was blinding, a sickening surge that made my vision swim with dark spots. But every single time I wanted to collapse back into the wheelchair, I pictured Caroline standing in front of a judge, dabbing her dry eyes with a pristine white handkerchief. I took my first step. The fiberglass cast dragged heavily across the warped linoleum floor. I took a second step. Sweat poured down my face, stinging the healing abrasions on my cheek. I practiced walking from the kitchen counter to the wood stove, then from the wood stove to the front door. Hours turned into days, and days bled into weeks. The halo brace kept my spine agonizingly rigid, but my legs slowly began to remember how to bear weight. Living on canned beans and bottled water, I dragged from an old emergency supply crate, my body grew lean and hardened. The soft, comfortable suburban logistics broker died in that freezing trailer. The man taking his place was forged in absolute isolation and quiet rage. As my mobility increased, so did my restless need to understand my surroundings. I began spending hours staring out the cracked window at the desolate landscape. The great wildfire 10 years ago had wiped out the lush apple orchard my father had loved so dearly. Thousands of charred, blackened stumps jutted out of the gray dirt like jagged teeth. It looked like a graveyard. But my mind kept snagging on a single memory, a conversation I had with my father in his hospital room just days before he passed away. I had asked him if he wanted me to sell the rural property to cover his medical debts. He had gripped my hand with surprising strength, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute intensity. He told me to keep the deed. He said, "Never sell the valley land. The soil is dead, but the roots hold power." At the time, I thought it was just the sentimental rambling of a dying man heavily medicated on morphine. But out here staring at the ruined earth, those words began to echo in my mind with a strange, compelling urgency. My father was not a poetic man. He was a pragmatic, hard-working farmer who measured the world in acres and crop yields. He did not speak in riddles unless he was trying to hide something important. By the end of my first month in exile, I could manage short distances outside using the wooden cane. The freezing rural wind whipped against my jacket as I stepped off the rusted porch, and boots crunched into the dry, frozen dirt. The property was vast and completely silent. About 200 yards from the trailer, sitting at the base of a sloping hill, were the skeletal remains of the old main barn. The wildfire had consumed the upper hayloft, and the roof leaving only a blackened wooden frame and a solid concrete foundation. I had ignored it entirely until now, assuming it was just another pile of useless debris. But my father's words drove me forward. The roots hold power. It took me nearly an hour to navigate the uneven terrain, leaning heavily on the cane and pausing constantly to catch my breath. The air smelled faintly of old ash and damp earth. When I finally reached the barn, I stepped carefully over a fallen, charred support beam. The interior was a chaotic mess of rotted planks, rusted farming equipment, and overgrown weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete. I spent the afternoon conducting a meticulous grid search of the foundation. I used the tip of my cane to sweep away piles of dead leaves and kicked aside chunks of burnt wood with my good boot. I did not know exactly what I was looking for, but the logistics of the property did not make sense. If this land was truly worthless, my father would have sold it. He would not have ordered me to hold on to a dead orchard. Near the back corner of the barn, underneath a collapsed pile of corrugated tin roofing, the tip of my cane struck something that did not sound right. It was a dull, hollow thud that resonated differently than the solid concrete foundation. I froze, the cold wind suddenly biting a little harder against my face. I dropped to my knees, groaning, as the impact jarred my healing bones. I used my uncasted hand to drag the heavy, rusted sheets of tin out of the way. Beneath the debris was a section of thick, heavy oak floorboards that had miraculously survived the fire. They were warped and dark with age, sitting flush against the concrete edge. I knocked on the wood with my knuckles. The hollow sound echoed up from beneath the planks. There was a cavity underneath. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I scrambled around the ruined barn, searching frantically for anything I could use as a pry bar. I found an old heavy iron crowbar, half buried in the dirt, near a rusted tractor axle. I dragged it back to the corner, wedging the flattened tip into the tight seam between the thick oak boards. The physical effort required was immense. I had to use the full weight of my upper body pressing down on the iron bar while keeping my spine perfectly straight inside the halo brace. The muscles in my good arm screamed in absolute agony. For a long moment, the ancient wood refused to yield. Then, with a loud splitting crack, the rusted nails gave way. The thick plank popped upward. I tossed the crowbar aside and grabbed the edge of the wood, ripping it out of its seating. A puff of dry, stale dust hit my face. I tore away the second plank, and then a third, exposing a dark, rectangular cavity set deep into the poured concrete foundation. Sitting at the bottom of the dusty hole was a massive industrial-grade steel floor safe. It was a brutal, ugly piece of machinery. The steel casing was pitted with surface rust, and the heavy mechanical combination dial was caked in decades of grime. This was not a standard home lockbox. This was a heavy-duty vault designed to survive fires, floods, and decades of neglect. It was exactly the kind of container a pragmatic farmer would use to hide something of immense, undeniable value. I sat back in the dirt, my chest heaving, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the discovery. My father had left something buried in the ashes. The roots hold power. He had literally buried his legacy beneath the soil. But finding the vault was only the first step of the nightmare. The heavy mechanical dial was completely seized by rust and time. I tried to turn it with my thumb, but the metal refused to budge a single millimeter. I had no combination, no keys, and absolutely no way to contact a locksmith without tipping off Caroline and Bradley to my location and my sudden mental clarity. If they found out I was coherent and uncovering hidden assets, they would use the guardianship order to legally confiscate whatever was inside this vault before I ever saw it. I was going to have to crack the steel myself. I spent the remainder of the afternoon dragging myself back and forth between the barn and the trailer. I scoured every inch of the ruined property for tools. I found a heavy rusted hand drill in an old metal toolbox beneath the kitchen sink of the trailer. I found a handful of dull, worn titanium drill bits wrapped in an oily rag. I found a small can of industrial lubricant and a heavy steel hammer. It was a pathetic arsenal against 2 inches of hardened steel plate, but it was all I had. The next 3 days were a descent into sheer, agonizing physical torture. I woke up at dawn, fueled by cold, canned soup and a burning, relentless rage. I hauled myself across the freezing dirt to the ruined barn and dropped down onto the concrete floor next to the exposed vault. I started by dousing the seized dial in lubricant, letting the oil soak deep into the rusted internal mechanisms. Then I applied the hand drill directly to the steel faceplate next to the dial housing. Without electricity, I had to manually crank the heavy gear wheel, grinding the dull titanium bit into the hardened metal surface. Every rotation required massive physical force. The repetitive motion sent brilliant flashes of pain shooting up my casted arm and into my neck. The halo brace restricted my movement, forcing me to lean over the hole at a highly unnatural, agonizing angle. By the end of the first day, my hands were blistered and bleeding. I had barely made a dent in the steel casing. I crawled back to the trailer in the pitch-black rural night, my body completely spent, shaking violently from exhaustion and the biting cold. But I returned to the barn the next morning. I returned because I remembered the receipt for my funeral casket. I returned because I remembered Bradley raising a glass of champagne in a courtroom while he finalized my legal execution. I ground the drill bit into the steel until the metal smoked and screamed in protest. When my right arm failed, I used the clumsy, heavy weight of my fiberglass cast to apply downward pressure on the handle. I hammered at the lock, housing chipping away at the rust, feeling the heavy vibrations rattle my shattered ribs. I did not stop for lunch. I did not stop for the blinding pain. I became a machine driven entirely by vengeance and desperation. On the third afternoon, the gray sky opened up, dumping a freezing, miserable sleet down through the ruined roof of the barn. The icy water soaked my jacket, chilling me to the bone. My hands were completely raw, the skin split open across my knuckles. The drill bit was ground down to a useless blunt nub. I was on the absolute brink of total physical collapse. My vision blurred, and the heavy iron hammer slipped from my exhausted grip, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against the cold, wet steel of the safe door. I was crying. Not from the physical agony, but from the sheer overwhelming frustration of being locked out of my own salvation. I gripped the heavy mechanical dial one last time. My bloody fingers slipped against the lubricated metal. I gritted my teeth, squeezing my eyes shut, and applied a brutal, twisting force to the dial. I poured every ounce of anger, every ounce of grief, and every ounce of survival instinct I had left into my wrist. A sharp, heavy metallic click echoed from deep inside the steel door. I froze. The sound was distinct. It was the heavy drop of the internal locking tumbler falling into place. The rust holding the mechanism hostage had finally shattered under the relentless days of grinding and hammering. I slowly grasped the thick iron handle bolted to the front of the door. I pulled upward, bracing my boots against the edges of the floorboard cavity. The heavy steel hinges groaned in loud, shrieking protest. The thick door cracked open, breaking the airtight seal that had held for decades. A rush of stale, preserved air hit my face. I pulled the heavy lid back entirely, letting it rest against the concrete. I leaned over the dark opening, my breath catching painfully in my throat. I wiped the freezing rain and sweat from my eyes, staring down into the belly of the vault. I expected stacks of forgotten cash. I expected heavy bars of gold or silver bullion. I expected something that looked like immediate, undeniable wealth. Instead, the entire floor safe was packed full of brittle, yellowed paper. I stared at the stacks of documents, my mind racing to understand what I was looking at. They were bound in thick leather portfolios, neatly organized and perfectly preserved away from the moisture and the fire. I reached down with trembling, bloodied fingers and pulled the heaviest portfolio from the top of the stack. I opened the thick leather cover, tracing my hand over the elegant 70-year-old typography stamped across the first page. It was not money. It was something infinitely more powerful. I pulled the heavy leather portfolio from the cold belly of the floor safe, my raw and bleeding fingers leaving dark, rusty smudges across the cracked brown hide. The physical exertion of tearing that vault open had pushed my shattered body to the absolute limit. My chest was heaving against the rigid confines of the titanium halo brace, and my breathing echoed loudly in the damp, quiet ruins of the burnt barn. I dropped to a seated position on the concrete foundation, resting my back against a charred wooden beam, and rested the heavy portfolio across my casted legs. I undid the tarnished brass buckles with my good thumb and index finger. The leather flap fell open. I stared down at the contents, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, a wave of profound disappointment washed over me. There were no neatly banded stacks of $100 bills. There were no heavy canvas sacks filled with gold or silver bullion. There were no bearer bonds or liquid assets that I could immediately use to hire a high-powered attorney and fight my way out of this rural hellscape. Instead, the entire floor safe was packed with brittle, yellowed paper. I let out a harsh, ragged breath that turned into a cloud of white mist in the freezing air. I felt incredibly foolish. I had spent 3 days grinding my body into a pulp, fueled by the desperate hope that my father had left me a financial lifeline. Now I was sitting in the freezing dirt, holding a stack of forgotten filing cabinet trash. I wanted to hurl the portfolio across the barn. I wanted to scream until my raw throat bled. But then my eyes caught the elegant, formal typography stamped across the top of the very first document. It was a massive, heavily bonded stack of legal parchment that looked to be at least 70 years old. The ink was faded to a dark sepia, but the official county seals pressed into the bottom corners were completely unmistakable. My professional instincts, honed by decades of navigating dense corporate logistics contracts and complex commercial freight agreements, instantly kicked in. I wiped the sweat and freezing rain from my eyes and leaned closer to the ancient pages. The first document was a comprehensive ironclad legal trust drafted by my grandfather in the late 1940s. It was an irrevocable, grandfathered legal entity that established absolute sovereign ownership over the specific 40-acre plot of land I was currently sitting on. I carefully flipped the delicate pages, moving past the standard property line. Boundary demarcations. Beneath the trust documents lay a thick stack of highly detailed geological surveys and hand-drawn topographical maps. The surveys were incredibly precise, detailing deep-core drilling samples and subterranean rock formations. My grandfather had not just mapped the surface dirt. He had mapped exactly what was buried hundreds of feet below the earth. I followed the intricate, faded blue lines drawn across the main topographical map. The lines traced a massive, naturally occurring subterranean aquifer. It was a sprawling underground ocean of pristine, pressurized artesian water trapped beneath layers of impermeable bedrock. And according to the survey lines, the absolute heart of that massive aquifer. The primary pressurized geyser point that fed the entire subterranean basin was located exactly beneath the 40 acres of my family's land. I flipped to the final legal document in the portfolio. It was a sovereign water rights decree, ratified and permanently sealed by the state Supreme Court over 7 decades ago. The legal jargon was dense, but the ultimate conclusion was devastatingly clear. In this specific rural county, water rights were not tied to general surface ownership. They operated under a strict historical doctrine of prior appropriation. My grandfather had been the very first person to officially tap and legally claim that underground basin. Because he possessed the senior most historical claim, the law granted his estate the absolute exclusive and sovereign rights to the water. Whoever controlled this specific 40-acre plot of scorched, seemingly worthless dirt possessed the legal authority to completely dictate the water supply for the surrounding 5,000 acres of the valley. Any person, any farmer, or any commercial developer who wanted to pull a single drop of moisture from that underground basin legally required the direct written authorization of my family's trust. My hands began to shake. The cold wind whistling through the ruined barn suddenly went completely unnoticed. I carefully bundled the brittle documents back into the heavy leather portfolio. I gripped my worn wooden cane, hauled my broken body up from the concrete floor, and began the agonizing trek back to the rusted, double-wide trailer. I did not feel the throbbing pain in my shattered legs. I did not feel the suffocating grip of the halo brace. I was entirely consumed by a terrifying electric surge of realization. I reached the trailer, dragging myself up the crumbling wooden steps, and kicked the front door shut against the freezing wind. I dropped the portfolio onto the small laminate kitchen table and threw 2 fresh logs into the cast-iron stove. The fire flared up, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the room. I reached into the pocket of my sweatpants and pulled out the cheap, plastic, prepaid smartphone that Sarah, the night shift nurse, had secretly given me back in the intensive care unit. The battery was hovering at 14%. I had kept the phone powered down for weeks to conserve the charge, waiting for an absolute emergency. This was it. I held the small device up near the cracked kitchen window, desperately searching for a cellular signal. The network indicator bounced between searching and a single weak bar of connection. It was just enough. I opened the web browser and navigated directly to the county assessor's public zoning portal. The website was clunky and slow to load over the terrible rural connection. I stood completely still, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for the digital maps to render on the small, scratched screen. When the interactive property map finally illuminated, I typed in the exact parcel number for my 40 acres. The screen zoomed in, outlining my small rectangular plot of land in bright yellow. I then pinched the screen with my thumb and index finger, slowly zooming outward to view the massive sprawling tracts of undeveloped land that bordered my property to the south and the east. I tapped on the digital boundary lines, pulling up the current registered ownership records for the adjacent 5,000 acres. The name of the registered property owner popped up in bold, undeniable black text. Oak Ridge Development Group. It was Bradley's corporate holding company. I stared at the glowing letters, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Everything instantly, violently clicked into place. The massive puzzle that had destroyed my life was finally completely solved. Bradley was a flashy, arrogant commercial developer who loved the spotlight, but despised the tedious, grinding background work of real estate law. He had spent the last 2 years quietly buying up thousands of acres of cheap rural farmland surrounding my property. His grand, heavily publicized vision was to build the ultimate $200 million luxury gated community. The blueprints I had seen in his office months ago featured sprawling manicured golf courses, massive artificial lakes, luxury country clubs, and hundreds of high-end residential mansions. But a project of that astronomical scale required a truly massive, uninterrupted municipal water supply. Bradley had clearly looked at the geographical surveys and seen the sprawling underground aquifer beneath the valley. He had purchased the 5,000 acres, assuming he could simply drill deep commercial wells and pump millions of gallons of water up to his golf courses and luxury pools. He made the most fatal, catastrophic mistake a real estate developer can possibly make. He only checked the surface rights. He never dug into the deep historical title deeds of the adjacent, burnt-out orchard. He looked at my 40 acres of scorched earth, saw a rotting, double-wide trailer, and a field of dead apple trees, and completely dismissed it. He assumed my father was just a stubborn, irrelevant old farmer clinging to ruined dirt. He assumed the water below his own land belonged to him. He had no idea that my grandfather had legally monopolized the entire artesian basin 70 years before Bradley was even born. Without access to that specific underground aquifer, Bradley's 5,000 acres of land were essentially a giant, useless desert. He could lay the concrete foundations. He could frame the luxury houses. But the county zoning board would never ever grant him the final commercial building permits or the certificates of occupancy without a legally verified, fully permitted municipal water source. Bradley's entire $200 million empire was currently being built on top of a dry, legally paralyzed sandbox, and Caroline had funded this massive oversight. When Bradley's initial investors started getting nervous about the missing water permits, the banks likely threatened to freeze his construction loans. He was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin and criminal fraud charges. He needed an emergency untraceable injection of liquid capital just to keep the contractors working and the bankers at bay while he desperately tried to bribe his way out of the zoning nightmare. That was why Caroline had stolen my $1.2 million retirement fund. That was why they had forged my signature to leverage my logistics company and my suburban home. They needed my money to plug the bleeding holes in Bradley's sinking ship. And when they realized I was scheduled to audit my own accounts, Caroline had taken me to the edge of a cliff in the Columbia River Gorge and casually sawed through my safety line. I was supposed to die a tragic, accidental death. She was supposed to inherit everything as the grieving widow wash away the financial discrepancies and collect a massive life insurance payout to fund the rest of her brother's fraudulent kingdom. When I miraculously survived the 80-foot fall, they panicked. They used the medical power of attorney and the fabricated psychiatric evaluations to legally erase me. They stripped me of my rights, labeled me a paranoid lunatic, and legally evicted me from my own life. Then, they made the ultimate beautiful, poetic mistake. They needed to banish me somewhere completely isolated, somewhere I could not contact a lawyer, somewhere they assumed I would quietly wither away and die from the physical trauma and the freezing cold. They looked at the legal deeds to my name and chose the one asset they truly believed was absolutely worthless. They dumped me at the dead orchard. They banished me directly on top of the kill switch to their entire stolen empire. I looked down at the leather portfolio resting on the kitchen table. I looked at the glowing screen of the prepaid phone showing the digital boundary lines of Bradley's doomed development. A sound started deep in my chest. It bubbled up through my shattered healing ribs and tore out of my throat. I threw my head back as far as the restrictive titanium halo brace would physically allow, and I laughed. It was a loud, booming, hysterical laugh that echoed off the peeling aluminum walls of the trailer. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated victory. I laughed until tears streamed down my face, and my chest ached with brilliant, beautiful agony. They thought power was defined by custom-tailored suits, luxury SUVs, and million-dollar suburban homes. They thought wealth was something you could steal by forging a signature on a digital banking portal. Caroline thought I was nothing more than an expendable asset, a blue-collar logistics broker who was entirely beneath her family's visionary greatness. She thought she had left me with absolutely nothing but dirt. But my father was right. The soil is dead, but the roots hold power. I reached out and placed my hand flat against the brittle 70-year-old parchment of my grandfather's trust. Bradley and Caroline had built a beautiful, towering castle out of glass and stolen money, and they had just unknowingly handed me the only heavy steel hammer in the entire county. I did not need to run. I did not need to beg a judge to listen to a man in a wheelchair. I did not need to desperately try to convince my former friends and my pastor that I was completely sane. I had the sovereign legal chokehold on the most valuable resource in the region, and my enemies had already bet their entire existence, their freedom, and their stolen wealth on a project they could never legally complete. I powered off the prepaid smartphone to save the last few percentages of the battery. I carefully closed the thick leather cover of the portfolio and rested my hands on top of it. The freezing wind howled violently against the thin rusted walls of the double-wide trailer, but for the first time since Caroline cut my rope on that cliff, I did not feel the cold. I felt a raging, unstoppable inferno. I was going to let them build their luxury community. I was going to let them spend every single stolen dollar of my retirement fund. I was going to let them host their ribbon-cutting ceremonies and drink their expensive champagne. And then, when they were standing at the absolute peak of their stolen glory, I was going to systematically, legally, and ruthlessly crush them. Crush. Knowledge is an incredibly dangerous burden when the legal system has officially classified you as a ghost. I sat alone at the small laminate kitchen table inside the freezing double-wide trailer, staring at the leather portfolio I had just hauled up from the burnt barn. The adrenaline that had fueled my agonizing physical labor was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating hypervigilance. I had the ultimate weapon resting right in front of me, a 70-year-old sovereign water rights trust that could instantly vaporize Bradley's entire $200 million real estate empire. But I could not simply walk into a courthouse and wave the brittle documents in the air. I was still a ward of the state. Caroline held my medical and legal guardianship. If I revealed my sudden cognitive clarity and presented this multi-million-dollar asset to a judge without ironclad protection, Caroline's elite legal team would immediately swarm. They would claim I stole the documents in a fit of paranoid mania. They would use her absolute authority as my guardian to legally confiscate the portfolio, lock the papers in a secure corporate vault, and bury the truth forever. Before I could launch my offensive, I had to sever the legal chains wrapped around my neck. I needed an attorney who operated completely outside of Bradley's wealthy sphere of influence. I needed Harrison. Arthur Harrison was my late father's personal attorney. He was a ruthless old-school bulldog of a litigator who had spent 40 years tearing apart corporate fraudsters and corrupt county politicians. He was currently semi-retired, operating out of a dusty wood-paneled office on the other side of the state. He was a man who did not care about expensive suits or country club memberships. He only cared about the brutal, unfiltered truth. I pulled the prepaid plastic smartphone from my sweatpants pocket. The battery was critically low, flashing a red warning symbol on the scratched screen. I dialed Harrison's personal cell phone number entirely from memory, praying he had not changed it in the decade since my father passed away. The line rang 4 times. Just as I thought the automated voicemail would engage, a gruff, gravelly voice answered. I spoke quietly, fighting the lingering rasp in my throat. I told him my name. I told him I was calling from a burner phone. I told him my wife had intentionally severed my climbing rope, stolen my retirement, and trapped me under a fraudulent guardianship order. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Any ordinary lawyer would have immediately assumed I was exactly the paranoid lunatic Caroline had painted me to be. They would have offered polite condolences and hung up. But Harrison had known my father. He knew the quiet, unshakable integrity of my family bloodline. He listened to the steady, unpanicked rhythm of my voice. I am sitting on 40 acres of burnt dirt, I told him, my grip tightening on the small phone. And I just cracked open a floor vault containing my grandfather's original subterranean water trust. Bradley is building his luxury development right on top of our aquifer. He does not have the deep title rights. I have the chokehold, Harrison. But I need you to break this guardianship before they realize what is buried out here. I will be there in 3 hours, Harrison replied, his voice suddenly sharp and fully awake. Do not speak to anyone else. Do not sign a single piece of paper. True to his word, a battered brown sedan crunched up the ruined gravel driveway long after the sun had set behind the mountains. Harrison stepped out of the vehicle wearing a faded trench coat, a lit cigar dangling from the corner of his mouth. He walked up the crumbling wooden steps of the trailer and stepped inside the freezing living room. He took one long, assessing look at my shattered legs, my fiberglass casts, and the heavy titanium halo brace bolted into my skull. His dark eyes hardened with a terrifying professional fury. He did not offer meaningless pity. He pulled out a chair, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the leather portfolio. For 2 straight hours, the only sound in the trailer was the crackling of the wood stove and the rustling of brittle parchment. Harrison read every single sentence of the geological surveys, the topographical maps, and the sovereign water rights decree sanctioned by the Supreme Court. As he turned the final page, a slow, predatory smile spread across his weathered face. "Your brother-in-law is a dead man walking," Harrison whispered, tapping a calloused finger against the Supreme Court seal. "This is not just a standard property deed, Thomas. This is an irrevocable monopoly. Bradley has poured tens of millions of stolen dollars into pouring concrete and framing mansions on land that has absolutely no municipal water access without your direct written consent. His entire project is a dry, illegal desert. Can we stop the construction?" I asked, leaning forward as far as my rigid spine would allow. "We can do a lot more than stop construction," Harrison growled, packing the documents back into his worn briefcase. "We are going to file a federal injunction, but you are entirely correct about the guardianship. If Caroline finds out you are legally competent and holding this trigger, she will use her proxy status to sign the water rights over to Bradley's holding company before we can even get a hearing on the docket. I need to build a shadow case. I need to prove to a judge that the guardianship was obtained through systemic, verifiable criminal fraud. I am taking this case on strict contingency, Thomas. We are going to bleed them completely dry." Harrison left the trailer that night, taking the original documents with him to lock inside a secure, heavily guarded bank vault. Over the next 2 weeks, my rotting, double-wide trailer became a silent command center. While Caroline and Bradley were back in the city drinking champagne and celebrating their stolen wealth, Harrison launched a massive, devastating counter-investigation. He hired a private investigator named Vance, a former federal agent who specialized in forensic accounting and municipal corruption. Vance did not bother interviewing my brainwashed neighbors or my manipulated pastor. He went straight into the dark, hidden financial arteries of Bradley's real estate empire. Harrison visited the trailer every few days under the cover of darkness, bringing me groceries, fresh medical bandages, and highly classified updates. The depth of the corruption Vance uncovered was absolutely staggering. Bradley knew the water rights in the valley were legally ambiguous. He had hired a junior zoning clerk to run a preliminary title search over a year ago. The clerk had flagged a potential historical conflict regarding a subterranean aquifer attached to my father's burnt property. But instead of negotiating a legal purchase of the rights, Bradley chose the path of extreme criminal arrogance. He took the $1.2 million Caroline had stolen from my retirement portfolio and used a massive portion of it to systematically bribe a senior city planning commissioner. Vance found the encrypted wire transfers routed through offshore shell companies. The commissioner had deliberately buried the junior clerk's report, falsified the environmental impact surveys, and pushed Bradley's commercial building permits through the municipal system without the required sovereign water clearances. They thought they had committed the perfect crime. Bradley and Caroline assumed I was a permanent dead end. They fully believed I would either perish in the hiking accident or rot away quietly in this forgotten trailer trapped forever in a medically induced fog. They gambled their entire freedom on the absolute certainty that a man in a wheelchair with a shattered skull would never crawl across the freezing dirt and crack open a rusted floor vault. Vance also uncovered the final damning piece of the puzzle regarding Caroline. He pulled the digital records from the insurance conglomerate, holding my policy. 3 days before Caroline suggested the hiking trip to the Columbia River Gorge, she had dramatically increased my accidental death coverage. She had maximized every single premium, ensuring she would receive an $8 million payout the moment my body hit the bottom of the canyon. The physical pain in my healing legs was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, hollow ache in my chest when Harrison showed me that insurance printout. My wife had priced out the exact value of my life, and she had decided I was worth exactly enough to cover her brother's fraudulent construction loans. But their massive web of lies was beginning to unravel, and Caroline was starting to sense the fraying threads. On a quiet, overcast Tuesday afternoon, the trap they had unknowingly set for themselves finally snapped completely shut. I was sitting by the cast-iron stove practicing my gripping exercises with my right hand when a sleek, black, corporate town car slowly crunched its way up my ruined gravel driveway. I instantly knew Caroline had not sent a luxury vehicle to check on my physical well-being. A tall, nervous-looking man in a cheap suit stepped out of the car. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and walked up to my crumbling porch with extreme caution, looking around the desolate, burnt property as if he expected a wild animal to jump out of the shadows. He knocked on the aluminum siding of the door. I grabbed my worn wooden cane. It was time to put on the performance of a lifetime. I had to convince this man that I was exactly the broken, mentally vacant victim they needed me to be. I slouched heavily in my wheelchair, letting my head loll slightly to the side against the rigid titanium bars of the halo brace. I forced my breathing to become shallow and erratic. I made my eyes wide, glassy, and completely unfocused. I unlocked the front door and let it swing open. "Thomas," the man asked, his voice dripping with forced professional sweetness. "I am a licensed notary public. Your wife Caroline sent me. She sends her deepest love and asked me to check on your rehabilitation." I offered a confused, slightly open-mouthed stare, offering a weak, trembling nod. The notary stepped inside the freezing living room, visibly shivering, as he pulled a pristine stack of legal documents from his briefcase. He placed them on the laminate kitchen table and pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. "Caroline is managing the complex financial burdens of your medical care," Thomas, the notary, said, speaking in a slow, patronizing tone. "She just needs your signature on this standard county tax liability waiver. It is just a routine municipal form to ensure the state does not penalize the family for the taxes owed on this rural property." I slowly dragged my gaze down to the documents resting on the table. My mind was razor sharp, scanning the dense paragraphs printed beneath the yellow sticky note that read, "Sign here." It was not a tax liability waiver. It was a legally binding quit-claim deed. Bradley must have finally realized the catastrophic vulnerability in his development plans. Perhaps a bank auditor had flagged the missing water rights, or perhaps the bribed city commissioner had gotten nervous and demanded Bradley secure the actual title to the aquifer. Regardless of the trigger, they were completely desperate. They needed me to permanently and legally surrender my ownership of the 40 acres and everything buried beneath it, transferring the entire estate directly into Caroline's name. If a legally competent man signed that document, Bradley would own the water, the luxury development would be saved, and I would be left with absolutely nothing. But I was not legally competent. Caroline had already sworn under oath that I was suffering from irreversible cognitive damage. I reached out with my heavily casted right hand, my fingers trembling violently in a perfectly orchestrated display of neurological failure. I grasped the heavy gold pen, holding it like a clumsy, uncoordinated child. I looked up at the notary, my eyes swimming with manufactured confusion and pathetic desperation. For Caroline, I rasped, my voice sounding incredibly weak and lost. To help Caroline. Yes, Thomas, the notary smiled warmly, completely falling for the deception. Just sign on the line to help Caroline. I lowered the pen to the signature block. I did not sign my actual name. I did not use the smooth, flowing cursive I had perfected over 20 years of signing massive logistics contracts. Instead, I pressed the golden nib hard into the paper, dragging it across the signature line in a chaotic, jagged, and completely unreadable scrawl. I intentionally misspelled my own last name, leaving out 3 letters, and dragging the ink completely off the designated line and onto the margin. It looked exactly like the desperate scribble of a man whose brain was entirely disconnected from his motor functions. The signature was a spectacular, beautiful piece of garbage. Any forensic handwriting expert on the planet would take one single look at that jagged disaster and testify in a court of law that the person holding the pen was severely incapacitated. Because Caroline had placed me under an emergency medical guardianship, I was legally forbidden from signing contracts. By tricking me into signing a fraudulent property deed while I was a ward of the state, she was committing massive, undeniable federal property fraud. I dropped the pen onto the table, letting my head loll back against the halo brace, and let out a long, confused sigh. The notary quickly snatched the documents from the table, blowing on the wet ink. He did not care that the signature looked like a chaotic child's drawing. He only cared that he had ink on the paper. He packed the fraudulent deed into his briefcase, offered me a sickening fake smile, and hurried out the door of the freezing trailer. I sat completely still in the center of the dark room, listening to the heavy tires of the corporate town car crunch back down the gravel driveway. I waited until the engine noise completely faded into the silence of the rural valley. Then I slowly sat up, perfectly straight. I dropped the helpless, confused facade. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the burner phone, and dialed Harrison's secure number. The bulldog answered on the first ring. They took the bait, I told him, a cold, terrifying calm, settling over my entire body. They brought the quitclaim deed. I gave them a signature that proves I am completely incapacitated. They just documented their own federal fraud. Excellent. Harrison growled through the speaker, the sound of a heavy lighter clicking in the background. The trap is officially armed. Get some rest, Thomas. Next week we are going to burn their entire world to the ground. The morning of the groundbreaking gala was bitterly cold, but the fire burning inside my chest made the freezing rural wind completely irrelevant. The heavy wooden door of the double-wide trailer opened, and Harrison stepped inside, followed by a private, discreet orthopedic specialist he had retained entirely off the books. I was sitting rigidly in the wooden chair beside the cast-iron stove, waiting. It was time to shed the physical chains of my legal captivity. The specialist worked in total silence, using specialized tools to carefully unbolt the heavy titanium halo brace from my skull. The physical relief of having that rigid metal cage removed was indescribable, but it was immediately followed by a terrifying wave of vulnerability. For the first time in weeks, my healing neck had to support the entire weight of my head. I gripped the armrests of the chair, gritting my teeth against the deep, radiating soreness in my spine. The doctor removed the heavy, cumbersome fiberglass casts from my arms and legs, replacing them with sleek, highly compressed medical braces that could be easily hidden beneath clothing. Harrison handed me a garment bag. Inside was a meticulously tailored dark charcoal wool suit. It was the exact kind of high-end aggressive armor I used to wear when negotiating massive logistics contracts with hostile freight conglomerates. Slipping my battered body into that suit was an excruciating process. Every movement pulled at my shattered ribs and sent shooting spikes of pain down my healing legs, but as I pulled the jacket over my shoulders and adjusted the silk tie, I looked at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror of the trailer. I no longer looked like a tragic victim. I no longer looked like a ward of the state waiting to die in the dirt. I looked like a man preparing to execute a hostile corporate takeover. Harrison handed me a thick, solid walking cane, crafted from polished dark wood and capped with a heavy silver handle. I gripped it tightly, testing my weight. My legs burned fiercely, but the compressed braces held firm. I could walk. I could stand tall. I could look my enemies directly in the eye. We left the dead orchard and drove the short distance to the sprawling adjacent property line. Bradley and Caroline had spared absolutely no expense for the grand unveiling of the Oak Ridge Development Group luxury community. As Harrison parked his battered sedan on a high dirt ridge overlooking the construction site, I stared down at the obscene, staggering display of my stolen wealth. A massive, pristine white pavilion tent had been erected directly over the freshly graded earth where the future community clubhouse was slated to be built. The entrance was flanked by towering floral arrangements and private valet stations. A fleet of luxury vehicles, black town cars, and expensive imported SUVs lined the temporary gravel parking lot. I could see local politicians, wealthy investors, and high society socialites mingling near the entrance, holding crystal flutes of imported champagne. The faint, elegant sound of a live string quartet drifted up the hill, completely masking the ugly truth of how this entire event was being funded. Every single drop of champagne, every single expensive hors d'oeuvre, and every single perfectly tailored uniform worn by the catering staff was paid for directly out of my liquidated retirement portfolio. They were dancing on my grave. They were celebrating a massive fraudulent victory built on a severed climbing rope and a bribed city commissioner. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the gravel. The biting wind caught the edges of my suit jacket. Harrison killed the engine and stepped out beside me, clutching a heavy leather briefcase in his right hand. He looked down at the massive white tent, took a long drag from his cigar, and offered a grim, predatory smile. "They have no idea the executioner is already in the building," Harrison murmured, blowing a cloud of gray smoke into the freezing air. "Let us go ruin their perfect day, Thomas." I gripped the silver handle of my cane and began the long walk down the hill toward the pavilion. Every single step required a massive amount of concentrated effort. My right leg throbbed with a dull, sickening ache, but my posture remained completely flawless. I did not limp. I did not stagger. I marched toward the tent with the measured, terrifying cadence of a man who had already conquered death. As we approached the main entrance, the 2 private security guards hired to monitor the guest list stepped forward to block our path. They were large, intimidating men wearing dark suits and earpieces. One of them held up a clipboard, his eyes quickly scanning my face and then dropping to the heavy silver cane. "Excuse me, sir." The guard said, his tone firm but polite. "This is a private invitation-only event. I need to see your credentials." I did not stop walking. I did not even slow my pace. I locked my eyes directly onto his and projected the deep, unyielding authority I had spent decades cultivating in the cutthroat logistics industry. "My name is Thomas," I said, my voice cutting through the crisp air with absolute chilling clarity. "I am the primary financier of this entire development. Step aside immediately." The sheer overwhelming confidence in my voice caught the guard completely off guard. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing uncertainly at his partner. In the private security world, you never physically block a billionaire investor who acts like he owns the very ground you are standing on. That tiny hesitation was all I needed. I swept past them both without breaking my stride, Harrison following closely at my side like a dark shadow. We stepped through the massive canvas flaps and entered the main event space of the pavilion. The sensory shift was jarring. The air inside the tent was incredibly warm, heated by towering portable generators and filled with the rich, heavy scent of roasted meats and expensive perfume. Hundreds of elegantly dressed guests milled about the polished hardwood flooring that had been temporarily laid over the dirt. At the far end of the tent was a raised wooden stage flanked by massive digital screens displaying gorgeous fabricated architectural renderings of the luxury golf courses and pristine artificial lakes. Standing center stage behind a clear acrylic podium was Bradley. He was holding a microphone, beaming with absolute arrogance, delivering his grand visionary speech to the captivated crowd. This community represents the absolute pinnacle of sustainable luxury. Bradley projected over the state-of-the-art sound system, his custom navy suit catching the bright stage lights. "We are not just building houses here today. We are building a permanent, thriving legacy for this entire county. We are laying a foundation that will last for generations." I began walking directly down the wide center aisle of the pavilion. The heavy silver cap of my cane struck the temporary wooden floorboards with a sharp, rhythmic crack. 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 The sound was distinct, cutting directly through the low murmur of the crowd and the soft playing of the string quartet. People near the back of the tent began to turn their heads. As they registered my face, the polite, murmuring conversations instantly died. The silence began to spread rapidly forward, like a contagious virus rippling through the crowd row by row as I continued my relentless march toward the stage. I saw Pastor Gregory standing near the catered buffet line, holding a small plate of appetizers. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, his jaw physically dropped open. The color completely drained from his distinguished silver-haired face. This was the man who had patted my casted arm in the intensive care unit and treated me like a delusional, brain-damaged invalid. He was staring at me now, as if a ghost had just materialized from thin air. He knew instantly that a man suffering from catastrophic cognitive failure did not wear a tailored suit and walk with the terrifying purpose of a predator. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the front row of the audience. Sitting directly beneath the stage, holding court, in a reserved VIP section, was Caroline. She was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald green designer gown that likely cost more than my first car. Heavy diamond earrings sparkled in the stage lights. She was the absolute picture of a wealthy, radiant socialite. She was smiling up at her brother on the stage, completely absorbed in the magnificent illusion of her stolen life. She reached out blindly to take a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter. As her manicured fingers closed around the delicate crystal stem, the absolute suffocating silence of the massive tent finally caught her attention. She noticed the hundreds of guests staring toward the center aisle. She slowly turned her head in her chair, a polite, curious smile still lingering on her lips. Her eyes met mine. The polite smile did not simply fade, it violently shattered. The sheer, unadulterated terror that exploded across Caroline's face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my entire life. Her perfectly arranged features twisted into an expression of absolute sickening panic. The muscles in her hand completely relaxed in shock. The crystal champagne flute slipped through her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, explosive crash, shattering into 100 glittering pieces and sending expensive alcohol splashing across the hem of her emerald gown. The sound of the breaking glass echoed through the dead, silent pavilion like a gunshot. On the stage, Bradley stopped speaking mid-sentence. He lowered the microphone, peering out over the glare of the bright stage lights to see what had caused the disruption. When he finally registered my figure standing in the center aisle, standing tall without a halo brace or a wheelchair, he physically recoiled. He took a rapid, clumsy step backward, bumping hard against the acrylic podium and nearly knocking it over. Thomas Bradley stammered, his booming, confident voice shrinking into a high-pitched, panicked squeak. The microphone amplified his absolute terror for the entire room to hear. I did not stop walking. I reached the front row, stepping directly over the puddle of spilled champagne and shattered crystal at Caroline's feet. She was completely frozen in her chair, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and glassy with fear. She looked at me, as if the earth itself had just cracked open to swallow her whole. She knew. In that single terrifying second of eye contact, she knew that I remembered everything about the cliff, and she knew her entire legal fortress was about to burn. Bradley desperately tried to recover his composure. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked frantically toward the perimeter of the tent, waving his hand at the private security team rushing down the side aisles. "Security!" Bradley shouted into the microphone, his voice cracking with artificial, desperate authority. "Security, please intervene immediately. My brother-in-law is a severely ill man. He is a ward of the state. He has escaped from his secure medical care facility, and he is having a violent paranoid episode. Please gently escort him out of the building before he hurts himself." The heavy footsteps of 4 large security guards thundered across the wooden floorboards as they closed in on my position from behind. The wealthy investors and politicians in the crowd began to murmur in confusion and alarm, stepping back to give the guards a clear path. Caroline finally found her voice, jumping out of her chair and playing the desperate protective guardian. "Thomas, please stop this!" Caroline cried out, reaching her hands toward me with fabricated hysterical concern. "You are confused. Your brain is bleeding. You do not know where you are. Let the nice men take you back to your room. I promise I will come visit you tomorrow." The sheer audacity of her performance sent a fresh, blinding wave of rage through my veins. The lead security guard reached out his massive hand, closing firmly over the shoulder of my suit jacket. "Sir, you need to come with us right now," the guard commanded, pulling backward to physically drag me away from the stage. I did not fight him physically. I did not struggle. I simply turned my head slowly and looked the massive guard directly in the eyes. I did not blink. I channeled every ounce of the cold, ruthless fury I had forged in that freezing trailer over the last month. "Remove your hand from my jacket," I said quietly. The tone was absolutely deadly. It was not the voice of a confused, brain-damaged victim. It was the voice of a man giving his final warning. "I am stepping onto that stage. If you attempt to stop me, my attorney standing right behind you will ensure you spend the next 10 years in federal court defending yourself against aggravated assault charges." The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously over my shoulder to where Harrison was standing. The old bulldog attorney pulled back the edge of his trench coat, just enough to reveal the heavy leather briefcase staring the security team down with a terrifying, predatory grin. The guard felt the absolute shift in power. He realized he was standing in the middle of a massive corporate war, and he immediately released his grip on my jacket, taking a slow, cautious step backward. I turned back to the stage. Bradley was hyperventilating, completely trapped behind the clear podium. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just sprung. I raised my right foot, ignoring the agonizing spike of pain shooting up my tibia, and placed my polished boot on the first wooden step of the stage. I climbed the short staircase, using my silver cane for balance, and stepped directly into the blinding glare of the spotlights. The entire crowd of elite investors, politicians, and spiritual leaders watched in absolute paralyzed silence. Bradley tried to block my path to the center of the stage. He stepped in front of the podium, holding his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Thomas, do not do this," Bradley hissed under his breath, his eyes darting frantically toward the crowd. "We can fix this. We can talk about the accounts. I will give you everything back. Just turn around and walk away before you ruin everything." I looked at the sweating, terrified fraud standing in front of me. I thought about the 80-foot drop into the gorge. I thought about the rusted trailer, the freezing cold, and the receipt for my own funeral casket. I did not answer him. I simply lifted my heavy silver cane and slammed the metal tip hard into the toes of his custom Italian leather shoes. Bradley gasped in pain, instinctively hopping backward on one foot. I stepped into the space he vacated, positioning myself directly behind the clear acrylic podium. I rested my cane against the side of the stage and reached out with my right hand. I smoothly pulled the microphone from its heavy metal stand, letting my eyes sweep over the hundreds of shocked, silent faces staring up at me. I locked eyes with Caroline one final time. I smiled calmly, and I raised the microphone to my lips. I looked out over the sea of stunned, silent faces from behind the clear acrylic podium. The sheer opulence of the massive white pavilion tent stood in sickening contrast to the rusted, double-wide trailer where my wife and brother-in-law had banished me to die. Crystal chandeliers hung from the heavy canvas rafters, casting a warm, golden glow over the hundreds of elite investors, local politicians and wealthy socialites who had gathered to celebrate the creation of a luxury empire. They were all wearing designer suits and expensive evening gowns, holding imported champagne paid for directly by my stolen retirement fund. The faint acoustic feedback from the microphone whined for a fraction of a second before settling into a heavy, oppressive stillness. Just out of my peripheral vision, Bradley was groaning in absolute agony, clutching his crushed foot where I had just driven the heavy silver tip of my walking cane. I adjusted the lapels of my dark charcoal wool suit. I did not look like a man who had recently survived a catastrophic 80-foot plunge into a rocky gorge. I did not look like a broken, mentally deficient ward of the state. I looked exactly like what I was. I was a veteran corporate logistics broker who had spent 20 years navigating cutthroat commercial negotiations, and I currently held the financial futures of every single person in this room in the palm of my hand. I gripped the microphone, making sure my posture was flawlessly straight, despite the burning pain radiating through my healing spine. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice in anger. I spoke with a deadly measured calm that amplified the absolute authority of my words. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing off the high canvas ceiling and rolling clearly over the top of the frozen crowd. "My name is Thomas. Many of you know me. Many of you do not. You may have been told by the man currently cowering behind me on this stage that I am a severely brain-damaged invalid. You may have been told by my wife, sitting in the front row with spilled champagne on her dress, that I am suffering from violent, paranoid delusions. I assure you my mind has never been clearer than it is in this exact moment. And the only delusion inside this pavilion is the $200 million fairy tale you have all been sold." A low, uneasy murmur began to ripple through the back rows of the audience. Wealthy hedge fund managers and municipal bond underwriters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I saw Pastor Gregory standing near the catered buffet line, his face drained of all color, staring at me, as if the ground had just opened up. They had all written massive checks to Oak Ridge Development Group. They were expecting a massive return on their investments. They were expecting manicured golf courses, sprawling country clubs, and pristine artificial lakes. I reached inside the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a single heavily bonded sheet of legal paper bearing the fresh raised seal of a federal judge. I held it up high for the entire room to see. The bright stage lights caught the pristine white surface illuminating the dense legal text. "What you are looking at is not a fabrication," I continued, my tone dropping to a chilling analytical register. "It is a legally verified, federally mandated injunction that my attorney and I filed this morning." I let my eyes slowly sweep across the faces of the most powerful people in the county, making sure they felt the absolute weight of what I was about to say. "As of 8 o'clock today, a federal judge has frozen all construction on this site," I announced. "My father's trust owns every drop of water beneath this soil. Your $200 million investment is currently a dry, useless sandbox." The reaction was not a gasp. It was an explosion. The polite high society atmosphere of the groundbreaking gala instantly disintegrated into pure chaotic panic. The string quartet entirely abandoned their instruments. Men in expensive suits immediately began shouting, pulling cell phones from their pockets to frantically dial their wealth brokers. Wealthy socialites dropped their plates of catered hors d'oeuvres, the porcelain shattering against the temporary hardwood floorboards. The politicians who had accepted Bradley's illegal bribes began sweating through their silk collars, their eyes darting wildly toward the exits as they realized their political careers were suddenly tied to a massive federal fraud. "This luxury community requires millions of gallons of municipal water to legally operate," I explained smoothly over the rising roar of the panicked crowd. "Bradley promised you he had secured the necessary permits." He lied. He completely bypassed the deep title surveys because he was far too arrogant to check the historical registry. My late father left me 40 acres of burnt, seemingly worthless orchard land directly adjacent to this property. Bradley assumed it was just dead soil. But beneath that soil sits the primary geyser point for the entire underground aquifer feeding this valley. I leaned an inch closer to the microphone, delivering the final devastating piece of the puzzle. My grandfather drafted an irrevocable trust 70 years ago, securing the exclusive sovereign water rights to that entire subterranean basin under the doctrine of prior appropriation, I said. He owned it. My father owned it. And now I own it. I'm never going to grant Oak Ridge Development Group the legal authorization to tap a single drop of it. Your money has been buried in a desert. The investors completely turned on Bradley. The wealthy elite transformed into bloodthirsty sharks the moment they realized their capital had been vaporized. Several prominent real estate backers bypassed the hired security guards and marched directly toward the edge of the stage, their faces contorted in pure financial fury. They pointed angry fingers at the podium, demanding to see the geological surveys, demanding answers about the missing permits, and demanding the immediate return of their liquid assets. Bradley tried to salvage the illusion. He limped heavily toward the microphone, his face flushed a dangerous mottled crimson. He raised his hands desperately, trying to quiet the raging room. "It is a lie!" Bradley screamed, spit flying from his lips, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his collapsing empire. "He is a lunatic. The project is fully permitted. He does not own the water. We own the water. Do not listen to him. Security, get him off this stage." But the crowd was not listening to Bradley anymore. They were looking at his terrified, sweating face and his trembling hands. They smelled the absolute desperation pouring off him. The security guards did not move an inch, recognizing that they were witnessing a catastrophic legal bloodbath that was far above their pay grade. Down in the VIP section, Caroline finally realized the pristine facade was completely shattered. Her brother's fraudulent kingdom was burning to the ground in front of the entire county, and the millions of dollars she had stolen from me were about to be exposed to federal authorities. She snapped. She abandoned the polite grieving widow act entirely. She scrambled out of her chair, her emerald green designer gown catching on the sharp edge of a metal folding chair and tearing audibly. She ignored the ripped silk, marching directly up the wooden stairs of the stage with a look of pure, unadulterated malice twisting her features. She bypassed Bradley entirely and charged straight toward me, her eyes wild and utterly vicious. She did not try to speak into the microphone. She knew the public audience was lost. She got right into my personal space, grabbing the lapels of my tailored suit with both hands. Her voice was a venomous, hissing whisper, meant only for me. "You are going to stop this right now, Thomas," she spat, her fingers trembling as she tried to physically shake my shoulders. "You think you are so clever with your little piece of paper? You think you can humiliate me in front of my friends? But you forgot one crucial detail. You are a legally incapacitated ward of the state. I am your medical proxy. I am your guardian. I make every single one of your financial decisions. I am going to call the hospital orderlies right now. Have you heavily sedated, dragged back to a psychiatric ward, and I will sign those water rights over to Bradley myself before the sun goes down." I did not flinch. I did not step away from her grasping, desperate hands. I stood my ground, staring down at the woman who had looked me directly in the eyes while sawing through my climbing rope. The woman who had purchased my burial casket 24 hours before, trying to murder me. I reached calmly into my other suit pocket and pulled out a slim, dark blue legal folder. I gently but firmly peeled her manicured fingers off my suit jacket, gripping her wrists with the unyielding strength I had built back up while surviving in the freezing rural dirt. I pressed the dark blue folder firmly against her chest until she instinctively took it. "Not anymore," I said, my voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper that carried the weight of an absolute avalanche. Caroline looked down at the folder in her hands, her furious expression faltering. "The State Medical Board spent the last 48 hours reviewing the heavily fabricated psychiatric evaluations you submitted to the probate court," I explained, watching the color completely drain from her cheeks. My attorney presented them with indisputable neurological scans and sworn testimony from 3 independent board-certified trauma surgeons. They proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the private doctors Bradley paid completely lied about my cognitive state. Caroline's mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The folder trembled violently in her grip. The probate judge was absolutely furious to learn she had been manipulated into participating in elder financial abuse. I continued leaning in close, so she could hear the absolute finality in my words over the screaming chaos of the investors behind her. "The guardianship was dissolved yesterday. I am a fully competent sovereign citizen. I have my life back, and you have absolutely no power over me ever again." 2 weeks had passed since the massive white pavilion tent collapsed into absolute chaos. The air in the downtown corporate law office felt distinctly different than the freezing wind of the rural valley. It was heavily filtered, aggressively air-conditioned, and smelled of expensive floor polish. We were seated around an enormous mahogany conference table. The walls were constructed of soundproof glass overlooking the sprawling city skyline. I sat perfectly still in my tailored charcoal suit. The highly compressed medical braces beneath my clothes held my healing bones rigid, but I did not need a wooden cane to command the room today. Beside me sat Harrison, flipping slowly through a stack of legal documents with the calm, methodical patience of an executioner sharpening a heavy blade. Across the wide expanse of polished wood sat the people who had tried to erase my existence. Bradley looked like a man who had aged an entire decade in 14 days. His custom navy suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His collar was damp with nervous sweat. His hands resting on the table trembled constantly. The arrogant real estate visionary who had mocked me in the dirt was completely gone. Beside him sat Caroline. The glamorous emerald-wearing socialite from the gala had vanished entirely. She wore a dull gray blouse, her face completely devoid of makeup, her eyes darting nervously around the room like a cornered animal. Their high-priced corporate litigators sat beside them in absolute silence, looking incredibly uncomfortable. They knew exactly how bad the math was. The court stenographer tapped away at her machine, recording the deafening silence in the room. The federal injunction had held firm. Construction on the Oak Ridge luxury development had been violently halted. The heavy excavators and cranes were currently sitting idle in the mud, without the sovereign water rights from my father's rural property. The entire $200 million luxury community was legally paralyzed. The commercial banks had officially panicked. Bradley had missed a massive critical loan payment just 3 days ago. Foreclosure notices were already being drafted by the furious lenders. He was staring down the barrel of total financial annihilation. The deposition was supposed to be a highly structured legal proceeding. It was supposed to be an orderly exchange of formal interrogatories. But Bradley could not maintain the facade. The crushing pressure of the impending bankruptcy shattered his discipline. He ignored the frantic whispered warnings from his lead counsel. He leaned across the mahogany table, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely desperate. "Thomas, please," Bradley pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You have made your point. You humiliated us in front of the entire county. You shut down the site. We are losing hundreds of thousands of dollars every single day the tractors sit idle. The creditors are calling my private residence. I am begging you to end this. We can write up a purchase agreement right now. I will buy the water rights from the trust. Name your absolute highest price." I just stared at him. I did not move a single muscle. "I will give you the retirement money back." Bradley continued, his words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "Every single dollar we transferred from your Vanguard accounts. I will pay it back with a 20% penalty fee. I will give you equity in the development group. You can be a senior partner. We are family, Thomas. You cannot just destroy my entire life over a misunderstanding. It is just a piece of paper. Just sign the water rights over and we can all go back to normal." Caroline leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Thomas," she whispered desperately, trying to channel the tearful devotion she had weaponized against me in the hospital. "I made terrible mistakes. I was so stressed about the money. I was not thinking clearly. But I am still your wife. We built a beautiful life together. You cannot let them take everything from us. Please just help us fix this." The sheer audacity of their begging sent a cold, dark thrill straight through my veins. They were still trying to manipulate me. They still believed I was the soft, accommodating logistics broker who would always write the check to keep the peace. They did not understand that the man they had married and exploited had died at the bottom of the Columbia River Gorge. The man sitting across from them was forged in a freezing, rusted trailer on 40 acres of burnt dirt. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany. I leaned forward, letting my cold gaze lock directly onto Bradley. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard as I finally spoke. "There is no negotiation today, Bradley," I said. My voice was a flat, clinical monotone that stripped all the oxygen from the room. "You do not get to offer me my own retirement fund as a bargaining chip. That money is already mine. You stole it through forgery and wire fraud. I am not selling you the water rights to my father's land. I am not taking a partnership in a fraudulent company. Your luxury development is a corpse, and I am going to let it rot in the sun." Bradley's jaw dropped. The last tiny spark of hope extinguished in his bloodshot eyes. His lawyer tried to interject, stammering loudly about reasonable settlements and prolonged civil litigation, but Harrison slammed his open palm down on the table, instantly silencing the highly paid attorney. "Here are my exact, non-negotiable terms for the civil damages you have caused," I continued, never breaking eye contact with the man who had abandoned me in a wheelchair. "First, you will execute a complete, immediate restitution of every single dollar liquidated from my accounts. Second, you are going to transfer the title of the $1.5 million suburban home back into my name, free and clear of any encumbrances. The exact same home you legally evicted me from when you dumped me in the dirt. Caroline let out a sharp, horrified gasp. "You cannot take the house," she cried, her voice echoing with panic. "Where am I supposed to live?" I ignored her completely. "Third," I said, shifting my gaze back to Bradley, "you are going to sign a legally binding consent order for the complete and total liquidation of the Oak Ridge Development Group. Every corporate asset, every company vehicle, and every piece of heavy machinery will be auctioned off to satisfy the punitive financial damages you inflicted upon me. You will never build another property in this state. You are going to surrender your entire empire today." Bradley sank back into his heavy leather chair. He put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently as quiet sobs began to escape his chest. The great real estate visionary was reduced to a weeping, broken shell. He realized I was not just taking his money, I was actively erasing his identity. Caroline stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She realized the civil slaughter was absolute and unyielding. "You are a monster," she hissed, her face twisting into a furious snarl. "You can take the house, you can take the business, but we will just declare bankruptcy. We will walk away. You cannot keep me trapped forever." I leaned back in my chair, casually adjusting the cuffs of my tailored shirt. "I never wanted to keep you trapped, Caroline. I just needed to keep you sitting in that chair until the guest of honor arrived." Right on cue, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. The room fell into a dead, terrified silence as Detective Miller walked in. He was wearing the exact same rumpled gray suit from the intensive care unit, but the exhausted pity I had seen in his eyes weeks ago was entirely gone. He looked at Caroline with the cold, hard focus of a law enforcement officer who had finally cornered his prey. Two uniformed city police officers stepped into the room right behind him, standing rigidly by the exit. Caroline froze. The remaining color instantly vanished from her face. She looked at the police officers, then at Detective Miller, her eyes widening in absolute primal terror. Harrison calmly unclasped his heavy leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick, meticulously organized legal binder and slid it smoothly across the mahogany table, directly toward Detective Miller. This was not a binder of fabricated psychiatric evaluations. This was the absolute, undeniable truth. Detective Harrison said, his voice rumbling with deep satisfaction. "As requested, we are officially handing over the findings of our independent private investigation. We believe you will find the evidence extremely compelling." I looked directly at Bradley, who was staring at the binder as if it were a live explosive. For the court record, I stated clearly, ensuring the stenographer captured every single syllable. "This file contains encrypted emails and offshore bank routing numbers proving that Bradley deliberately bribed a senior city zoning commissioner to bypass the sovereign water rights on his development site. It is a comprehensive paper trail of federal bribery and commercial fraud." Bradley let out a pathetic, choked whimper. His high-priced lawyers immediately stood up loudly advising their client not to say another word. The attorneys instantly realized they were no longer defending a civil lawsuit. They were now sitting in the middle of a massive federal criminal investigation. But the final nail in the coffin belonged to my wife. "And Detective Miller," I said, turning my cold gaze onto Caroline. "The second section of that binder contains the subpoenaed digital records from my life insurance provider. It details a massive unauthorized policy increase executed directly from my wife's personal laptop. She maximized my accidental death benefits to $8 million exactly 24 hours before she drove me to the Columbia River Gorge. It provides the exact motive, the exact timeline, and the exact financial incentive for premeditated attempted murder." The silence in the room was absolute. The soft clicking of the stenographer's keyboard finally stopped entirely. Caroline tried to stand up. She tried to open her mouth to spin another beautiful, tragic lie, but there was nowhere left to run. Her perfect social facade was completely shattered into a million pieces. The receipt for the funeral casket was no longer a simple clerical error. It was the final devastating piece of a horrific verified criminal conspiracy. Caroline Detective Miller said, his voice booming with absolute terrifying authority. "Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." She did not fight. The sheer overwhelming weight of the absolute checkmate crushed the fight right out of her bones. The uniformed officers stepped forward, pulling her arms firmly behind her. The sharp, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed beautifully across the polished mahogany table. It was the exact same metallic click I had heard on the cliff edge right before she drew her hunting knife. But this time I was the one holding the line. The harsh clack of the steel ratchets sliding into place echoed against the soundproof glass of the high-rise conference room. It was a sharp, definitive sound that instantly severed 24 years of marriage, decades of misplaced trust, and every single lie Caroline had ever told. She did not scream right away. She simply stared down at her wrists, her mind completely unable to process the reality that her meticulously constructed reality had just been violently dismantled. The uniform officers pulled her arms securely behind her back. Detective Miller began reading her the Miranda rights, in a voice completely devoid of sympathy. He listed the charges with clinical precision. Attempted insurance fraud, aggravated spousal financial abuse, forgery, wire fraud. He deliberately left the attempted murder charge hanging in the air, a looming inevitable federal hammer that would drop the moment the forensic laboratory finished pulling the frayed nylon fibers from the Columbia River Gorge. Caroline finally found her voice as the officers began to guide her toward the heavy mahogany doors. She dug her expensive heels into the thick corporate carpet, turning her head to look back at me. The pristine, elegant socialite mask had entirely melted away, revealing the terrified, desperate core of the woman underneath. "Thomas," she begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical sob. "Thomas, tell them to stop. Tell them we can work this out at home. You know I love you. You know I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just scared. Bradley pressured me. He made me do it. Please do not let them take me away in front of everyone." I sat perfectly still in my chair, resting my hands on the silver handle of my polished wooden cane. I looked at the woman who had watched me fall 80 feet into a rocky abyss. I looked at the woman who had shopped for my burial plot while I was oiling our climbing carabiners. I felt absolutely nothing. The well of grief and betrayal had run completely dry, leaving only the hardened, impenetrable armor I had forged in the freezing dirt of my rural banishment. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I did not even blink. I just watched in absolute silence as Detective Miller gave a subtle nod to the uniforms, and they pulled her out into the bright, busy hallway of the law firm. Her hysterical sobbing faded down the corridor, replaced immediately by the heavy, authoritative footsteps of 3 federal agents stepping into the conference room. Bradley did not even attempt to fight or argue. The moment the FBI agents presented the federal arrest warrant for bribery and systemic municipal corruption, his legs gave out completely. He collapsed back into his leather chair, weeping openly into his hands. His high-priced corporate litigators immediately stepped away from him, packing their briefcases and distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of their disgraced client. They knew the money paying their exorbitant hourly fees was stolen, and they wanted absolutely no part of the impending federal indictments. Harrison casually closed his thick leather binder, the distinct snap of the clasp, sounding like a judge's final gavel. He stood up, adjusted his faded trench coat, and looked down at the weeping real estate developer. "You should have done your title research, Bradley." Harrison rumbled his voice, rough and deeply satisfied. It is a fatal mistake to build a castle on someone else's foundation. We walked out of the corporate high-rise together. The moment the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open, the crisp, cool city air hit my face. I stopped on the concrete sidewalk, leaning slightly on my cane, and took a deep, unrestricted breath. The suffocating, terrifying weight I had carried since the day my climbing rope snapped was entirely gone. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a ward of the state. I was a free man who had just reclaimed his entire existence from the jaws of absolute ruin. Time moves differently when you are no longer fighting simply to survive the day. The next 6 months were a blur of aggressive physical rehabilitation, complex legal victories, and monumental financial restructuring. I did not return to the sprawling $1.5 million suburban home that Caroline and Bradley had so cruelly evicted me from. The very moment Harrison legally forced the title back into my name, I put the property on the open market. I sold it to a nice, quiet family from the coast, transferring the massive influx of clean capital directly into a secure, newly established private trust. I had zero desire to walk those hardwood floors ever again. The house was tainted by the ghost of a marriage that had never been real. Instead, I returned to the valley. The harsh, freezing winter eventually surrendered to a bright, vibrant spring. I stood on the edge of the property on a warm Tuesday morning, leaning comfortably against the sturdy wooden railing of my massive, newly constructed wraparound porch. The rusted, peeling, double-wide trailer was completely gone. I had hired a local demolition crew to haul the rotting aluminum box away the very same week Bradley was denied federal bail. In its place stood a breathtaking custom-built log home. It was constructed from massive hand-peeled cedar trunks and featured towering floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling expanse of the valley. A heavy river rock fireplace anchored the grand living room, providing a deep, comforting warmth that permanently banished the freezing nightmares of my early recovery. The house was a fortress of light and solid timber, built directly over the poured concrete foundation of the old barn. The heavy steel floor safe that held my grandfather's legacy was now beautifully integrated into the floor of my private home office, protected and honored. My physical body had undergone a transformation just as radical as the landscape. The rigid titanium halo brace was a distant memory. The heavy fiberglass casts had been removed months ago. I still carried the silver-handled walking cane, but I rarely needed to put my full weight on it. I walked with a slight, permanent hitch in my right stride, a quiet, lingering reminder of the 80-foot fall, but my muscles were lean and strong. I had spent the entire spring working alongside the construction crews, swinging hammers and carrying lumber, rebuilding my physical strength with the exact same relentless determination I used to rebuild my life. The true miracle, however, lay beyond the edge of my porch. The 40 acres of charred, blackened apple stumps were gone. In their place, thousands of vibrant, healthy green saplings stretched out in perfect, meticulous rows under the golden morning sun. The dead soil had been aggressively treated, tilled, and rejuvenated. The valley was alive again. I did not sell the sovereign water rights to another greedy commercial developer. I refused to let the pristine underground aquifer be drained to fill artificial luxury pools and manicured country club golf courses. Instead, Harrison and I brokered a massive, unprecedented deal with a regional sustainable agricultural cooperative. The cooperative was composed of dozens of multi-generational family farmers who desperately needed a reliable, legally secure water source to expand their organic crop production across the county. I sold them a highly regulated, environmentally capped permanent lease to the subterranean aquifer. The deal guaranteed the absolute protection of the local water table while providing the farming community with the vital resources they needed to thrive. The financial compensation for the sovereign water lease was staggering. The agricultural cooperative, backed by massive federal farming grants and clean energy subsidies, paid my trust tens of millions of dollars. The influx of generational wealth was securely locked into a diversified portfolio that would easily outlast my lifetime. But more importantly, the deal honored the exact spirit of my father's dying wish. The land remained green. The valley remained agricultural. The roots truly held the power. I poured myself a steaming mug of black coffee from the custom copper pot in my kitchen and walked back out onto the cedar deck. The morning air smelled richly of damp earth and fresh pine needles. Far off in the distance, just barely visible over the rolling green hills, sat the rusting, abandoned skeleton of the Oak Ridge Development Group. The massive luxury project had completely collapsed into highly publicized bankruptcy. The sprawling acres of dirt were sitting empty, fenced off by miles of cheap chain link and warning signs from the federal bank liquidators. The half-framed wooden mansions were slowly rotting under the rain, a permanent ugly monument to Bradley's towering arrogance and fatal greed. Bradley was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary facility on the other side of the state, serving the first year of a 15-year sentence for systemic wire fraud, bribery, and financial conspiracy. His entire life was confined to a tiny concrete cell. Caroline was faring no better. Her highly publicized criminal trial had become a massive spectacle in the local media. The prosecution played the audio recordings of her tearful, fabricated church speeches, contrasting them directly against the time-stamped receipt for my premium oak burial casket. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on every single count of attempted insurance fraud, forgery, and severe spousal financial abuse. She was stripped of every designer dress, every piece of diamond jewelry, and every single ounce of the high society status she had valued more than my life. She was locked away in a state correctional facility, entirely forgotten by the wealthy friends she had desperately tried to impress. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee, letting the deep, bitter warmth spread through my chest. I looked out over the thriving green valley, watching the morning sunlight catch the tiny, sparkling irrigation sprinklers watering the new apple saplings. Caroline thought power was a bank account and a designer dress. She cut the rope because she thought I was dead weight. She completely believed that by taking my money and stripping away my mobility, she was erasing my ability to fight back. She did not realize that sometimes a man has to fall to the absolute bottom of a rocky gorge to find the true foundation meant to build his empire. She thought the dirt was a punishment. She did not understand that the dirt was the exact place where seeds are planted. They chose the hollow, fragile facade of stolen wealth. I chose the undeniable truth hidden in the scorched earth. I survived the fall. I survived the freezing dark. I survived the absolute betrayal of the person I trusted most in this world. And I did not just crawl out of the abyss. I bought the entire mountain. If you have ever survived a devastating betrayal from someone you trusted most, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to know that hitting rock bottom is not the end of your story, but merely the heavy foundation for your ultimate comeback. Drop a comment below telling me how you survived your hardest moment and proved your enemies wrong. And please subscribe to the channel for more stories of brutal truth survival and ultimate victory over deception. Take care of yourselves out there, and always remember to check your own safety lines.